Sorry. Just wanted to get your attention. Good afternoon. It's wonderful to see so many people here today actively engaged in the process and wanting to hear more about what Common Core is, the impact it will have on Pennsylvania, and most importantly, the impact it will have on our students and their families. There are many sides to the debate on standards and many unanswered questions we will seek to address today. Because the issue is so broad, the hearing is limited to Common Core only. If the committee receives Chapter 4 regulations from the State Board of Education, a hearing will be held to specifically discuss that very issue, which will probably happen anyway. If necessary, I will remind participants to limit the discussion to Common Core. Before we get started, in a hearing this size, I would be remiss not to remind participants and the audience how a Senate committee hearing is conducted and what is expected. Testimony will be received from invited speakers. There will not be an opportunity today, unfortunately, for additional public comment. We ask for respect for those who are speaking. This will be an orderly discussion. In addition to this room, there are 2 other hearing rooms to accommodate the overflow. The hearing will be simulcast in both rooms. The hearing and all the testimony is also available online at senatorfalmer.com. Cell phones and cameras are allowed, but we ask for minimal disruptions. Each panel will have the opportunity to present its viewpoint. Depending on time, the committee will allow for further discussion and debate collectively among the panelists. This hearing will conclude between 3:30 and 3:45, unfortunately. Several of our members, myself included, and Senator Dinniman included, must attend a 3:45 organizational meeting of the Special Education Funding Commission. So please forgive us for that. With those housekeeping items out of the way, I look forward to an informative hearing of open and honest brokers as we seek to understand what is best for Pennsylvania and our students. Senator Dinniman.
Thank you, Chairman Fulmer. It's in the Senate tradition, both chairs have an opportunity for an opening statement. We need to understand what Common Core is all about and what it means. There are 3 separate aspects of Common Core as we're seeing evolve here. One is the Common Core standards themselves. Second is the question of how did they come about? How did they evolve? And thirdly is the question of how they're going to be implemented, whether it's simply a charade, a show, or it's real in terms of the education of our students. We in the Democratic caucus have taken a stand, all 23 of us, in which we do not oppose Common Core standards per se. We recognize that there are serious and legitimate questions about how it came about that Chairman Fulmer is going to be focusing on today. And we feel very strongly that to put the Common Core standards together with required exams for graduation is inappropriate. We feel that the department has not been forthcoming and honest with either the legislature or with the citizens in terms of the cost. We believe that this will result in a $300 million unfunded mandate on the citizens of this Commonwealth at the very moment where all of our school districts are in financial catastrophes. While Philadelphia might not open, we are worried about how we're going to put required tests onto the students in that district who might not even be there to take the test. There's a question of priorities. Let me also add 2 other things, Mr. Chairman, if I may. The state of Indiana, who faced the same questions that we face today, yesterday did the following. And let me read you from the Washington Post. Indiana, one of the most education reform-minded states in recent years, is postponing implementation of the Common Core initiative so that there can be more discussion on the quality and impact of the standards. Governor Mike Pence, a Republican governor, it's a Republican legislature, I might add, similar to Pennsylvania. The only Democrat in there is the superintendent of instruction. Governor Mike Pence signed a bill Saturday that halts implementation as of Wednesday. This was a compromise between the forces that want Common Core to go forward because they say it will raise academic achievement, and the forces who believe that the standards are not even as good as Indiana's old standards and want education decisions to remain local. In fact, as part of this delay, there will be a cost analysis done on core standards implementation. Mr. Chairman, if I may, on one other matter before I close here, I will. One of our real concerns has been this matter of cost. Mr. Tiller, Tim, who represents the department, has repeatedly said the cost is negligible. There are no costs involved, that the budgets currently can take care of it. For the record, I'd like to submit to you statements from 3 of our school districts. Understand that the school districts that I represent in Chester County are some of the best in the nation. They only have 3 or 4 or 5%. In fact, in TE, we only have 0.08% who are not meeting proficiency. By the way, it shows that a local community knows what it's doing, doesn't it? But the point here, Mike, Senator Fulmer, is that the Westchester district, we have our IU has informed us that they are asking the district. The Westchester district indicates that at minimum, the supplemental instruction will cost them $315,000 a year. And that doesn't include the projects. The Downingtown district told us as a result of the department telling them they had to take juniors this year to establish the baseline for Keystones and teach and have them do Biology 1, which most of these students haven't taken in 2 years, had to spend, if you took the staff time and the money, $750,000. So please, we beg the department, and we believe that before anything should be done, we need a physical analysis of what this means. Because what the department is saying is not even what our best districts in this Commonwealth. And remember, the more students who don't pass the test, the more expense for the school district, since they can take it twice, and they also have the matter of project assessment. So, Mr. Chairman, I'm going to submit these for the record, and I'm also going to submit the 18 questions that the Democratic Caucus has that we announced in our news conference that we have, including whether the department had any authority to issue these standards in the first place based on Article 2, Section 1 of our state constitution. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
We will receive those and put them into record, Senator Dinniman. Now, we'll go to our first speaker before the committee, and this will be Dr. Carolyn Dumaresque, who's Deputy Secretary for the Office of Elementary and Secondary Education. Secretary Dumaresque, just make sure that your microphone is on, which would be a green light.
You got it.
There.
You're on. Go on.
It was green, but it wasn't a bright green. Okay. Thank you, Chairman Fulmer and Chairman Dinniman, and members of the Senate Education Committee for holding this hearing to discuss Pennsylvania's Common Core. And I appreciate the opportunity to provide a historical perspective of the state's academic standards, to explain the development of Pennsylvania's Common Core and the benefits of adopting them, and to answer your questions if time permits. As you know, I'm Carolyn Dumaresque. I'm the Deputy Secretary for the Office of Elementary and Secondary Education, and before serving in my current role, I spent 44 years working in public education, including time as a math teacher, school superintendent for various school districts, and the executive director of the Pennsylvania State Education Association. The Pennsylvania Common Core is a set of improved academic standards in math and in English language arts, as adopted by the State Board of Education, that are intended to raise the rigor of education for Pennsylvania students. These standards will benefit the Commonwealth students by providing a clear expectation of the knowledge and the skills that they will need to successfully pursue post-secondary opportunities, either in the workforce or in additional education or training. The standards provide clear and more rigorous direction for what every student needs to know and to ensure that every student, no matter what their background, receives a quality education that will prepare them for opportunities after high school. These standards are broadly supported across the Commonwealth because of the collaborative process used to develop them and the key role they will play in helping the Commonwealth achieve its economic and workforce goals. The development of the Pennsylvania Common Core Standards was a multi-year process that included input from the Department of Education, the State Board of Education, Pennsylvania teachers, Pennsylvania school administrators, the legislators, and the general public. Public hearings were held in Harrisburg and across Pennsylvania to ensure that these standards were the best interest of Pennsylvania students and taxpayers and were aligned with the needs of the Commonwealth's employers and would be supported by Pennsylvania's post-secondary education and training institutions. Businesses across the Commonwealth have endorsed the Pennsylvania Common Core as a way to improve students' knowledge, comprehension, and the ability to apply analytical skills in both math and reading. Adoption of the Pennsylvania Common Core will help to ensure that Pennsylvania students will perform comparably to those from other states and be competitive for purposes of post-secondary and career placement. Mastery of the standards will also reduce the need for remediation at the post-secondary level, reducing costs for families and students by reducing the time needed for degree completion. Although there are numerous benefits of adopting the Pennsylvania's Common Core standards, as evidenced by the widespread support for their adoption throughout the state, I understand there are still some concerns about the adoption of the standards. Unfortunately, many of the concerns, at least that the Department has heard regarding the Pennsylvania Common Core, are not based on fact as it relates to have Pennsylvania's adoption and Pennsylvania's implementation. They are from other states. I hope that my remarks today will help inform the conversations on Pennsylvania's Common Core. First, it is important to understand what the Common Core, at least in Pennsylvania, is not. The Common Core is not a federally driven initiative. It does not usurp the state's ability to control its own academic standards, nor does it take away the local school district's control in approving curriculum and their standards and to attain them. They may add to these. It does not mandate curriculum from either the federal or the state level. It does not mandate specific textbooks or reading lists. It will not lead to massive data gathering on students, their parents, their families' personal information, and it will not cost the millions and millions of dollars that have been suggested to implement. And finally, it is certainly not a dumbing down of Pennsylvania's education system. As a mother of 2 children who attended Pennsylvania's public schools, a former Pennsylvania educator and administrator, and a citizen of this Commonwealth, I would be very concerned if the above statements were true, but fortunately for us, they are not. Academic standards are statements of what students are expected to know at specific grade levels. Standards are the goal line that are to be achieved in specific subject areas. Schools, local school districts, help their students reach that goal line through locally developed curriculum, lesson plans, and other tools that are approved at the local level. In Pennsylvania, the adoption of curriculum and the selection of materials and textbooks has been and will continue to be under the purview of locally elected school boards. The adoption of the Pennsylvania's Common Core will not change this long-standing practice. Pennsylvania and other states began adopting standards in the 1990s. At this time, the State Board adopted its first set of standards in math and in reading, writing, speaking, and listening. The original standards became effective in January of 1999. Additional standards in other subjects were later adopted between 2002 and 2006. Pennsylvania was a leader at that time in these efforts. Other states then began to adopt standards. However, the level of rigor and the quality of the standards varied significantly among the states. The differences among the states were noticed by higher ed institutions, employers, and other groups, particularly when students matriculated to those institutions from other states. As a result, states began to recognize the need for a common benchmark in the core courses of reading and math, and a multi-state effort to begin this process began in 2004. Several years later, a formal effort was coordinated by two entities: the National Governors Association, or NGA, which represents all state chiefs executives, our governor, and the Council of Chief State School Officers, CCSSO, which represents the state's top education official, our Secretary of Education. The NGA and the CCSSO work collaboratively with state officials, teachers and parents, and other groups from across the country to develop model standards in math and English language arts. The model standards created by the state-led initiative are now called Common Core. The federal government was not involved in this process and, by its own rules, may not require any state to adopt these standards. States can adopt the model standards in full, they can adopt model standards in part, or decide not to adopt them at all. The Pennsylvania State Board originally adopted the Model Common Core curriculum, Model Core standards for math and reading in full in 2010. Since then, the State Board, based on input from Pennsylvania educators, decided to amend the Common Core in collaboration with educators from across the state to improve them and to modify them to meet Pennsylvania's specific post-secondary and workforce needs. This process resulted in what we call Pennsylvania's Common Core standards, which are similar but not identical to the models proposed by NGA and the CCSSO. So in closing, I'm submitting two documents for the committee's consideration. First is an attachment explaining the history and the public involvement in the development of Pennsylvania's Common Core. The attachment lists the many public forums, the work groups, the hearings that were conducted throughout the Commonwealth to solicit input in the development of these standards. And I would like to publicly thank all of those educators who participated in writing the Pennsylvania Common Core, and also those who submitted comments. The second attachment is a copy of Pennsylvania's Common Core, which is also posted on the State Board's website. I'd ask the members of this committee and the general public to please review the actual text of the standards. Contrary to what other states may be doing or what you may be hearing from others, the Pennsylvania Common Core does not do what is expected. Inside these standards, for example, it will show you that we ask in math for kindergarten and first grade and second grade children to be able to count from tens to 100, to be able to add, subtract, multiply, to use decimals, to use fractions. This is what we're asking Pennsylvania students to do. In reading, we're asking our young ones to understand what a textbook is, what a table of contents means, how to figure out the theme and the characters. Please read these standards to see what, in fact, our standards are asking our students to do. I understand that there may be confusion. There's confusion even at the federal level, because in the beginning of May, when we received a letter that approved our Keystones for use instead of the 11th grade test, the federal government also said, oh, and we understand that you're going to be using one of the national tests. We quickly responded on May 1st that said, no, you are confused. Pennsylvania will not be using a national test. We've developed our own Keystones for our 11th grade and for our high schools, and we've developed our own tests. So if the federal government is confused, I can imagine others might be as to what Pennsylvania is doing. However, our standards provide Pennsylvania students and education professionals a more rigorous and quality set of standards from which to learn and from which to teach. This is why the State Board, the Corbett administration, and many groups across the state support them. I thank you very much for the opportunity to talk with you today and hopefully to give some perspective of what Pennsylvania is doing.
Thank you very much, Deputy Secretary. I'm going to open up with a few questions, and then I'll open it to the Chair Dinniman and then the rest of the committee. Reading all the testimony, I'm struck by a seemingly recurring theme. our education system is broken. I was especially intrigued by one statistic in 2012. Pennsylvania schools gave high school diplomas to nearly 45,000 students despite their failure to show proficiency on 11th grade PSSAs and of their 12th grade retakes. This amounts to 34%, about 1 in 3 of our public school students graduating despite failing to show proficiency. My question to you is, how and why are we graduating students failing to demonstrate proficiency?
First, one answer to the question is because they're not used for graduation requirements. It is merely to participate in the test is all that's required from the state. You're not required to pass the test. I would also say one of the other concerns that we may is not that our students may not be bright, but the farther away from instruction they have to take a test, the more difficult it is to try to remember some of the data, which is why our Keystone exams are meant to be end-of-course exams taken closest to instruction. That should help our students pass with proficiency.
Although I've only been chair of the Senate Education Committee for a few months, I've been a member of the committee since joining the General Assembly. During this time, it's occurred to me that our educational woes in this state is very much like a road with nails. Rather than getting the nails off the road, we just keep on changing the tires. Convince me I'm wrong, and especially convince me that Common Core isn't simply another change of tires, maybe nail-resistant tires, but I doubt if you'll find those, while we continue to ignore the nails in the road to quality education in Pennsylvania.
First, you'd have to help me identify what those nails are so I can help you move them. But I think one of the things that gives me more hope that this is a good path to go. We know one of the most proven educational advances that advances student achievement is when we have clear expectations of students that are rigorous and we, in fact, test and hold ourselves accountable for the students learning those. That's been proven over and over again to be one of the most important educational improvements that we can do. I also feel very comfortable that it's Pennsylvania educators who came together in K-12 and also higher ed folks that came together to say, what should we be teaching in the baseline subjects of reading and math to improve our education in Pennsylvania? And it is from these Pennsylvania educators that we have the standards that we have now. So I'm hopeful with that collaboration between basic and higher education, clear expectations and accountability, and closest to instruction, that we'll be able to see improvement.
And I understand what you're saying. Just recently, Senator Dinniman and I and the committee had a hearing in Lebanon on outside-the-box thinking of how we can meet the needs of our students in each specific school district. We had it on hybrid learning. We heard the open campus process that's happening over in Lancaster County right now between Penn Manor High School, Hempfield, and Manheim Township. We heard it from Black Lick School District out in the western part of the state. And the hearing was very informative to me. And I saw 3 underlining points of that hearing. One, it wasn't generated from the Department of Education, and it wasn't from the State Board of Education, number 1. 2, it was bottom up. Each district saying what was going to meet the best needs of their students in their districts. And 3, they were doing it themselves. And they were being outside the box. My greatest concern about standardization, and this is my own personal opinion, as chair of this committee, I've tried to be very open-minded and very balanced. But my greatest concern about standardization is that our kids aren't Big Macs. It's great for McDonald's to have the Big Mac taste the same as it does in Philadelphia and Atlanta and Georgia and Philadelphia. But our students are individual people. And my greatest concern about standardization is that it will take away the creativity and moving forward. Now, I totally understand. And when you see the billions and tens of billions of dollars that are spent on our educational system today, and to see that 45,000 students graduated non-proficient, and to hear from our business community that they're not ready for the workplace, I understand where all this is coming from. But just as Mike Fulmer, aside from chairman of the Education Committee, just from my personal opinions, is that I am so much concerned that this is just changing tires and not actually taking the nails off the road.
I think you made an excellent point. I would say that we're very well aware of the hybrid. In fact, the state, through our Title I, our Title II money, supported that training effort for the hybrid learning. So we're very much a part of that. But hybrid learning is a teaching strategy and a teaching technique.
Sure.
You still need to have clear expectations for students to meet. That's a perfect example of local control. They decide how they want to deliver that curriculum, the teaching methodologies, in fact, the online programs. The local gets to decide that. The state needs to at least set, here's the floor, here are the standards you need. How you get there, and this is a great example of that, is a local decision. And I applaud the efforts of trying to meet individual students' learning styles by differentiating the instruction. It's an excellent example.
My last question to you, and then moving forward, because we want to stay on time, and I want to give a fair chance for my fellow committee members to ask questions. What have been the total cost to date to implement Common Core, and what are the future expected costs for both the Commonwealth and individual school districts?
Implementing the Common Core, let me first start with the state taxpayer expense, the state budget that we've had, which was bringing all those people in to help us to write the Pennsylvania standards as we modified the Common Core. And bringing the people in reading and math in, helping to defray substitute costs and paying for their expenses, was about $200,000 to have those Pennsylvania educators come to help us develop our standards. Obviously, there are costs to the state for modifying the tests, the Keystone exams, and the PSSAs, and they have been built into the budget. It costs approximately $3 million to develop and standardize a Keystone exam, and then the cost of implementing those tests are about the same as the 11th grade tests. It's about $1 million a year for the 3 implementations of the different tests, the 3 different forms, math, reading, and science, in order to implement a year. That's a continuing cost that the state would have. We have already developed the 3 tests that we are now requiring. We will need to update our 3 to 8 tests. But I think what we need to recognize are what are new costs versus continuing costs. You always are replenishing in any state assessment system that you would have. You need to replenish those items because students need to not see those same ones over and over again. You constantly are replenishing those items. So you have a continuing cost of refreshing the tests, and you always have the cost of implementing. So there's no new costs in developing the 3 to 8 tests that we wouldn't have had normally in changing the test from the old standards to our Pennsylvania Common Core standards.
I'll be real quick, and the reason I asked you that question is that since being in the General Assembly, I always ask 3 questions at any of my committee hearings, and that is, how much is it going to cost? Who's going to pay for it? And is it going to be an unfunded mandate? And I oppose unfunded mandates like nobody's business. If we can't fund it from the state level, we should not expect and thrust it down upon our local officials to do so. So that's why I've asked that question, and I hope you are correct. And now I'm going to turn the questions over to Senator Dinniman.
Thank you, Mr. I have 4 essential questions here. If you're so confident in the cost, and in the cost for local school districts, and if the school districts are telling us incorrect information, and will continue to enter into the record what the school districts project their cost to be, where's the fiscal note? You know, IRRC itself said that one of the major problems that you were asked is how much does it cost the local districts? I read your response to the IRRC. You still don't explain how it costs the districts. You have things like, well, we can take this funds that we have for supplemental instruction and put it here, or we're getting rid of this program. We've gotten used to, from Governor Corbett and Secretary Zogby, they have preached to us the importance of fiscal responsibility. That's to their credit. And so we expect that any department under them will produce a fiscal note. There is no layout of costs. You've asked the legislature if the governor, and we hope not he doesn't do it, this decision, as you know, is in many ways up to the governor, but if the governor decides to go forward and the 20-day clock begins to start, then the legislature has to make a decision. We don't have any fiscal note in the Senate or in the House. So, you know, the key here, Carolyn, Secretary, is this. School districts now have, many of our school districts have anywhere from 25 to 60%, some 70% of their students not being proficient. You have told us these exams are going to get tougher because we're raising our standards, okay? Under the requirements that you want, all right, a student has 2 more times to take the test. And if they fail 2 more times, they can do a project assessment. Because of the cuts in education, there are over 10,000 less teachers today than there were 2 years ago. Almost 50% of our schools have ended tutoring. 32% of our schools have ended summer school. You talk about text materials, which the local districts are responsible. Between 50 and 60% of our schools, if you take the 2 years, have not purchased textbooks to save the money. And so the question is, and in Philadelphia, which has the highest number of students who aren't proficient, we read, if we don't give them money from the state, and the governor's given no indication he's given that money, that there'll be 3,000 less teachers in the school. There'll be no counselors, no librarians, and we might not even open in September. So who is going to give the supplemental instruction? Who's going to do the project assessment, which is a one-on-one basis? And you're not giving the money for it. So the taxpayers of Pennsylvania, through their property tax, will be paying through the roof so the local school districts can make up this money, and that's an unfunded mandate in my book. Now, you obviously disagree, but where is the fiscal note?
Well, let me first, and I know you know this, but the taxpayers already give $9.8 billion to basic education. So within the monies that are already provided, most districts have staff development days beyond the 180 days of instruction, and most districts do have materials and supplies and textbook budgets. What the State Board did when it adopted 3 years ago, the timeline for the implementation of Common Core standards, developed the fiscal note there and said, in anticipation of the fact that it is difficult fiscal times, we will put a 3-year runway in for districts to adjust and adapt and to use their budgets that are already existing for the purchase of materials and textbooks if they needed to, or for training, over the course of those 3 years.
But in all deference, Ms. Secretary, they're bankrupt. Reading is $60 million in debt. Philadelphia is almost $3 million in debt. The state has taken over school district after school district, Chester, York, Steelton, soon to be Steelton, as well as those small districts, Duquesne around Pittsburgh. Where is this money to come from? These districts have no tax base. They have the highest tax rates in the Commonwealth. You assume that we can put in this new program, and the state's going to say, aren't we wonderful? We raised the flag. We're wonderful because we have new high standards. But if you don't have the financial resources to get every single student to the top of the curriculum, it's a sham, it's a charade, and we're raising false hopes of the students. And I don't see in anything I've read, in all the research that I've done, where that fiscal note is. And I hope that Governor Corbett and Secretary Zogby, who stand for fiscal responsibility, will be responsible enough before this gets through, before the Senate and House have to make a decision to present us with that fiscal note. To say it's simply a transfer makes no sense when school districts are on the brink of bankruptcy. I appreciate what you're saying, but let me ask another question, Mr. Chairman. I have three. I'm only through the first. All right. Now the second is this. I did notice in your legislative history that you left out something very important. If you remember that Senator Paccola and I, Senator Paccola had the chairmanship before Senator Fulmer, we worked out an arrangement where we brought everyone in the education community together as one. Joe Torsella was chairman of the board at that time, okay? Mr. Secretary, the previous secretary was Secretary.
Dvorak.
Dvorak, Mr. Z, Dr. Z, as we called him. Now, under that arrangement, we tried to work, the compromise we worked out is that the Common Core test would be given as 1/3 of the total course grade. The reason for that was that we believe that the teachers who have these students for 180 days a year should have as much right to decide whether they graduate on a variety of evaluation as bureaucrats in Harrisburg, Washington, who are making up the tests. If you, without coming back to the legislature, the secretary applied to the department for standalone exams, you also, while you have permission to do the Keystones, you still have not completed, the federal government has not told you that the peer review is completed. So you have now begun the process with the baseline that was done this year, which is why Downingtown had to pay $750,000 was to get you the baseline. But you don't even have the federal approval.
That's incorrect, sir. We do have federal approval.
Then show me the letter that you have the approval from peer review. I'm not concerned that you have approval on Keystone. You do not have a letter from the federal government on peer review. You yourself stated to the Board of Education meeting, it's in the minute notes, that you have informal approval in terms of peer review. Do you have a formal approval in addition to the Keystones in terms?
There is no peer review.
What is it that you're waiting for then?
We have it. We have permission to use the Keystones.
You have permission to
in lieu
use
of
the
11th
Keystone.
grade standard.
All right. But what you don't have, Carolyn, is an exemption from the No Child Left Behind Act. And until you get that exemption, the permission to use the Keystone is not an official permission.
Sir, you were wrong. I
Well,
beg to differ
we
with
will,
you.
you know, I appreciate your statement. I do not believe I'm wrong. And my experience with the Department of Education on the Common Core curriculum over the last year has shown me not to trust the department because you're the ones who, despite legislative agreement, ignored the legislature and went out and did it your own way. But let me get to the third question and then the fourth question quickly here, Mike, if I may. And the third question is this. We don't, you know, our caucus, in addition to raising the question about the money, also is very concerned with the whole use of standardized tests. And we would raise questions about accountability. We believe in accountability. We just don't believe the Keystone and the standardized tests are the best way to accountability. In fact, as you know, Mr. Secretary, 150 educators, professors, researchers in the state of Massachusetts a month ago came out against the standardized test as the best form to evaluate and have accountability in our students, and I'm happy to read you the document in which they said that. And I can give you other examples. Tell me, in addition to our teachers and our schools, being accountable, do you think the Department of Education has a responsibility for accountability?
Of course we have responsibility, but I'm a bit confused, Senator, on your concern about the use of the Keystones, because I do remember being chastised by you in public about reducing the number of Keystones from 10 to 3.
Because we, Madam Chairman, no, Mike,
Adam.
Madam Chairman, there was an arrangement, an understanding. It was 1/3 of a course. Everyone agreed. You and the previous secretary, who I understand is gone as of June 1st, you on your own, and you worked with the state board, ended that agreement. So you can't come back. I see Chairman Clymer here. He was with us when we worked these things out. You can't come back and say that standalone exams, with putting the burden on the school districts for remediation, is the same as we voted for. And by the way, I would appreciate if the department would be also honest on one other thing. You're telling people if we reject this, we automatically get 10 exams. There are 10 possible exams, but the code, and I'm happy to read it to you, I read it to you in the office the other day. By the way, anyone who wants to teach, this is the bureaucracy you go through, and that's why kids can't learn. But if, But in all seriousness,
Department didn't promulgate that book, just to make, just
well,
so
it's
that we
2
say.
volumes, by the way. I only showed you one.
Just saying, that's not us.
And unfortunately, I've learned to read it. But it says that that beyond the 3, that any other exam has to be authorized by the legislature and appropriations. So it's not fair to assume that we automatically get 10 exams or 4 or 5 exams. The legislators, when we went to see you with the 1/3 course assignment, part of the 1/3 of the course, were concerned that teaching to the test would eliminate civics, would eliminate, would dumb down the curriculum by not having geometry, without having chemistry. That's why we asked to be put in. But let me ask this question.
Could I just correct one thing that you said?
Yes.
When you said the department alone made the decision to disengage the 1/3.
There was a board.
No, I would remind you that part of the Chapter 4 regulations that were adopted put together 2 groups. One was a local advisory committee and the other was a state advisory committee. It was based on recommendations from those conversations that recognized the difficulty of putting 1/3 of the grade and getting the grades out in time, and no standardized grading system. Just let me finish. No standardized grading system, and the complications of administering that 1/3 of the grade, asked to have a standalone exam as a local option. It was those concerns we brought back to the state board which caused them to disengage it.
But you didn't bring those concerns back to the state legislature until recently,
Well,
when you put in the requirements.
Sir, we brought them to the state board when there are legislative representatives on the state board to discuss them.
And there are legislative representatives on the board, and the reason we're here today is so that we can clear up what, because I'm not sure the board itself know totally what they were approving. Certainly, there are many of us who didn't realize what you were doing at the time. But let me ask this, my last question is, Mike, you believe in accountability of your department. Yes, and of course you're going to answer yes. You believe that all of your, that you have basically a group of bright, energetic people. Then what I would say to the department is, do what you're going to do to the students. Let's give every member of the department the Common Core exam. And if they need remediation, by the way, don't look to us to give you more money because it's should come out of your money. And by the way, if that's going to happen, you can have little sessions in each of the bureaus where we say, rah, rah, we're going to do it for our school. In this case, we're going to do it for the bureau. What's good for the goose is good for the gander. And you make teachers take exams. They have to take the praxis exam. Every profession has exams. Well, it's about time that the Department of Education take exams too. You need to set a model. And let me add one other thing, Mike. Can you bring out your Constitution here? Bring out your Constitution. Now, I think it's time, Senator Fulmer, Mike, that you and I reintroduce into the Senate the piece of legislation we put in. And you know what we put in the Senate? And in the House, we said that we all swear allegiance to Pennsylvania's Constitution and to the federal Constitution. We put in a bill that said you don't take office until you pass a test on the Constitution of Pennsylvania and the state. Because finally, as my last comment, let me say, if we do it, let's do it the Common Core way. Not just on the facts of the Constitution, but all of the cases, all of the interpretation, so we can test the critical thinking ability of our legislators. If we're going to do it for the students, if we're going to stamp failure on 45,000 students or more students when we fail this, then let the legislators take a test. And so just as our district justices take a test, then let the department take a test. So just as the kids have to go home to their parents and say, I didn't succeed, then let the members of the department go home to their children and say, you know what, my son, I just failed the test. What's good, and let's be fair. So are you willing to do that in the department?
I'm very willing to take the Algebra 1 test, yes.
Not you. Yes. And by the way, I'm not sure I passed the Common Core Algebra 1 test, and I'm not sure that anyone in this room will. Well, if we're going to give the test to students and test teachers before they go in the classroom and test teachers on how to give the test, then it's about time all of us who are making policy take the test too. Thank you.
All I ask is that, I understand it's a very emotional issue, and I would, God forbid I ever take away your right to express yourself, but for time, we're just trying to keep this orderly, and please understand that, and thank you so much. But, Senator Smucker, I'm sorry, I was going to dismiss you, and you're not done yet.
Yes, sir. Well, hall pass,
And
can
then,
I
and then we
leave?
have Senator Tempest also has questions.
I'm sorry.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Good afternoon,
Good afternoon.
Madam Secretary. I'd like to start by thanking the Chair for scheduling a hearing on this topic. It's one that is of much interest to me for a number of reasons. One is, I think, we're in this ongoing discussion for a long time. We have been about the quality of our education of our students, and over the past few years that I've been in office here, one of my goals has been to ensure that every child in the Commonwealth has the opportunity for quality education. And I think there's much discussion going on in this regard, and has been for decades. Starting, you could point to the report that was put out during the Reagan administration entitled "A Nation at Risk," which, for perhaps the first time, pointed out that students in this country are falling behind the level of education that is provided in other countries. And even more sobering, the rate of students graduating, first of all, just graduating, getting a degree, is well behind that of other countries. And we all know that our students today, more than ever before, are competing in a global marketplace. Not only that, even of those students graduating, what they know when they leave the school system is behind that in other countries. And there's been, I think, much effort at all levels of government, from your local school board to the federal government, in the past few decades. Whether you agree with it or not, there's been there's been work at all of those levels to try to find solutions and try to improve our education system, and I think that is still a very worthy goal, one that we should all be focused on. So that is one of the reasons that this is of great interest to me. Secondly, I know that this is an interest that carries a lot of emotion currently. It's an issue that I've heard a lot about at town hall meetings and other events that I've held throughout the district, and I do those on a regular basis. I've been in office now for about 4.5 years and have always held town hall meetings, but particularly over the last 3 months, this has been the most talked about topic at town hall meetings that I've participated in. So frankly, I've spent a lot of time on this issue, and I've learned a lot over the last few months. I was surprised by some of the objections to it, and so spent time reviewing each of the objections and trying to get to the bottom of it. And that's really one of our toughest jobs as legislators. We can hear input on all sorts of issues and very different inputs, and they can become very emotional, very hotly debated, and one of the things that we have to do is try to find out the facts, and that's what I've tried to do in this particular issue. One of the things I learned is that when folks talk about Common Core, very often they are talking about issues well beyond Common Core. In fact, we just heard it today with some of Senator Dinniman's questions. Testing really isn't about Common Core, and I think there are some very good questions being asked about testing. We've been talking for years about schools being required to teach to the test. It's a problem, all right? Very much of a problem. But guess what? That's been going on for years before Common Core was even being talked about. So So that's an issue that was independent of Common Core, and still is in many regards. They're related, obviously. The Keystone exams, for instance, that Senator Dinniman brought up, were talked about well before the state in Pennsylvania here adopted Common Core. Now, you may ask yourself, and I will divert from Common Core just a little bit because I think this is closely related, are standards necessary? Do we need standards at all? I mean, I think that is a legitimate question to ask in this debate. And I think everyone needs to ask themselves that question. I think they are. If you identify the problem that we had, if you believe that, then you've got to find a way to solve that problem. And you really can't solve it until you begin to quantify the results that we're currently getting from our education system. So you've got to have some way of testing for accountability. I strongly believe that. And not only that, I think members of the panel at least here know, and I think many of the folks in the room know as well, that the funding that the state provides for K through 12 basic education is the largest one-line item in our budget. Over $5 billion per year in state dollars for going to local school districts to provide that education, that quality education that we expect for each of our children. We better know what we're getting for our buck, my view. Why should we as legislators appropriate $5 billion a year and not know what we're getting? And the only way you know that is to test. I don't know how else you get around that. So I think the discussion about teaching to the test, I think, which has been going on for a while, is a very good one to have. But it is independent of Common Core. So it's just, I think it's important that we focus on what Common Core really is, how we got to where we are, and then make the decisions accordingly. I'll be very interested in some of the testimony today of individuals who oppose Common Core to hear specifics about what was wrong with Common Core. And I do have a few questions, and I'll get to them very briefly. It's another thing I've noticed about this whole discussion in Common Core is that the objections to it can be very, very different. And in fact, this you've heard here today, too. There are many here who believe that Common Core is essentially dumbing down the curriculum. But the objection I heard from up here earlier today is that it is too rigorous and will result in more people failing to graduate from high school. They're very, very diametrically opposed opinions about Common Core. So there's not one specific objection that we have to consider. We really have to consider objections from all across the board. But I'd like to get back to the standards, and I'd like to ask the Secretary for just a little more information about the standards in Pennsylvania. Could you tell us when we first felt it was necessary to implement standards in Pennsylvania and why we felt it was necessary to do so at that time?
It was back in 1999 when the first standards were developed for exactly the reason you've articulated, was to determine whether investments made in public education were in fact being met. You know, were students learning and what were they learning? And those, again, Pennsylvania's been very judicious in looking at the standards and making sure that we're taking a narrow focus on reading and on mathematics as we've tried to adjust as we go forward. There are standards in all other subjects as guides for districts to adopt their curriculum. The ones that have gotten the most attention, however, are the reading and the math. So as we've adopted them, and then the world changes and technology changes and the competitive market changes, we adjust our standards. So it's an ongoing process. This would be the fourth iteration of our math and our English standards.
So how many, how many times have we changed the standards since that initial adoption?
That it would be, we've changed it 3 times. This would be the fourth, as we've taken, the third time was Common Core, and then this would be the modifications of Pennsylvania's adaptation.
And each time that change was made, were schools, was it necessary for schools to adapt in ways such as purchasing new textbooks, updating their curriculum, and those sort of things?
It would be hard to say, not knowing across the Commonwealth. It would depend on the age of their textbooks. It would depend on whether they needed to adjust their curriculum. As you've heard the Senator say, there are schools out there that have already been way beyond the standards. So that the need for those adjustments would have been less dramatic. It really would depend, again, on how far away from the new rigor that their curriculum would be. I would also suggest that there are a lot of, in some school districts now, the philosophy is not to adopt textbooks, hard textbooks, but to use various materials to supplement the basic text that you can get online. The department, in its Standards Aligned System portal, has begun to provide lots of voluntary material that districts can use to supplement their curriculum or the materials that they would like, recognizing that you buy a textbook and in a year it could be out of date, so that you want to make sure that you're flexible and that you can use these resources that we have. But again, that's totally up to the local level.
In speaking, I've stayed in regular touch with school districts in my area and have spoken to many of them about the transition to Common Core. In fact, they've been working on that for several years, which I want to clarify as well. When did we first adopt Common Core?
2010.
So this is in place. It was adopted 2010, and schools have had 3 years for its implementation deadline, really, to be fall of 2013.
To be fair, we have taken that original Common Core, and because we heard feedback from Pennsylvania educators that they thought that some of our Pennsylvania academic standards exceeded those, and they didn't think some of those Common Core standards went deep enough, we in fact brought those educators together, and there have been tweaks. That's what's before us now, those final tweaks.
Yes, thank you. And the point I wanted to make is that in my impression, at least, and you can speak to this, is that new standards that require schools to adapt their curriculum by new textbooks is nothing new. In fact, it's been going on since 1999. And schools have had a number of years, and many are well underway. Some may have it implemented already. And so the concerns that were raised earlier in regards to the costs associated with it, in my discussions with the schools in my district, and it could be different in other areas, but in the discussions with schools in my district and the IU, it's almost as if it's just another step in a continuum of progress over a period of time, not a dramatic new implementation. Would you agree with that?
That's what I'm hearing from many of the superintendents who have called me to say, please, we've been down this path. You've told us 3 years ago. Let's not have another change.
I've just go to another aspect of it. The issue of the curriculum itself. I've heard a lot of objections about the curriculum itself. One is a different emphasis on texts. Nonfiction text. Could you explain that? What do folks mean when they're talking about that, and what additional texts will be looked at that weren't included prior to this?
It would be in the standards, not the curriculum, because that would be developed at
Standards.
the local
I'm sorry. Yes, standards.
In the Pennsylvania's Common Core standards and reflected in the Common Core standards from the National Governors and CCSSO efforts, there was an interest on the part of not only colleges but also in the business world that students learn not just fiction, but they learn to read informational text, to original documents like the Constitution, like the Bill of Rights, biographies, letters from the Civil Wars that we have found, to be able to read and understand the themes and the point of view or the characters, that it's not always done in a fictional way, because in the real world, when we are assembling things for our home or when we're in the workforce, we're often reading informational text, not fiction. And so there is a move to balance that in the standards that we have before us, that it's not just all in fiction. But I would stress again, what documents that you would use, what textbooks you would use, how that curriculum is a local decision.
One of the other things I've done is spoken to teachers who have experience now. Either they're already teaching Common Core, it's already reflected in their curriculum this year, or it will be next year. And I've asked them to show me specific examples of how the standards have changed before Common Core and after. And I've seen examples as basic as the number of letters a kindergartner needs to recognize and be able to read at a given point in the kindergarten year, and the number after Common Core. And you know, I found, and I have 3 kids in public school myself, so I've seen a little bit of this, but I had no idea the level of detail that is incorporated in the standards. And so, you know, I would encourage anyone, and I would also ask Senator Fulmer to place, as well as with the testimony of this hearing, the actual Common Core standards. And anyone who has questions about the curriculum itself, I would ask them to compare the new curriculum to the old. And if you can find examples where it's dumbed down, I'd like to see it, because I haven't. Everything I've seen, starting from that kindergarten actual book based on the standards compared to a new book or to the old book, it's clearly an increase in the rigor. It's what I've seen. And so if anyone can show me something differently, I'm very open to reviewing that, and conversation with teachers has confirmed that as well. This is a more rigorous set of standards that, back to your point, and I help my kids with their homework. My oldest are in high school now. You know, at some point I can no longer help them, and there's a reason for that. Is because I'm convinced the curriculum they're using today is much more rigorous than when I was in school. And I think Common Core even makes it more rigorous. So that's been my experience. I'll have a lot of other questions, I'm sure, throughout, but I just wanted to make some of those comments and appreciate your answers to the questions.
Senator Templis.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Dumaresque, for being here. I guess my question is much more fundamental. This is an issue that is new to me, and like Senator Smucker, I've tried to learn as much about it as I can, and I've been looking forward to this hearing to do that. But what I've seen so far is there is concern at sort of both ends of the political spectrum. Groups that are not necessarily, you know, united on a lot of issues, concerned about, on the one hand, local control of education and whether the Common Core would be seizing local control in favor of state control or even national control. And then at the same time, concern about whether there are adequate resources in order to effectively implement Common Core. And I have both of those concerns. Particularly the concern about resources, because, as you know, I have a distressed school district in my district, the Harrisburg School District. And that resource issue is exacerbated by the way that the department has linked Common Core with the testing. And in some ways, I agree with Senator Smucker that you can have a separate discussion about that, but in some ways they're inherently linked. And that is exacerbating the resource issue. What I recall, and at the same time, just as an aside, you have interests that are not commonly aligned, like business interests and social services interests who are aligned in support of Common Core. And I think we need to acknowledge that as well. I think in some ways we've seen this before. I mean, I remember 25 years ago, not really paying attention to education policy in Harrisburg when outcomes-based education was a huge issue and received the same kind of attention and furor as this does. I guess my question is, I mean, why do you think there is this kind of outrage across the spectrum on this issue, and has the department, I guess, not learned from the prior experience, or should be learning better from the prior experience as to how to unveil this kind of policy, get public buy-in, dispel misunderstandings if there are? Because it seems like there is some value to having standards and making sure that students graduate with a common understanding of subjects that they will need to know for success in life. But the Department of Education, going back to prior administrations in attempting to implement standards, keeps inviting strong opposition, which becomes counterproductive to the ultimate goal. And so I think that's really my question is, why do you think this is happening, and what could the department be doing better to engage all of the stakeholders, the lots of people that we see today, to hear their concerns, address their concerns in a legitimate good faith way, and be able to move forward with some consensus on this issue?
I would say that the department thought it was in good faith effort with the State Board and the numbers of hearings that we had on Chapter 4, the previous Chapter 4, and the revised Chapter 4. Evidently, we didn't engender enough interest when we were doing all of those to hear all of the concerns that were given. We certainly have been working with the educational community as we've developed the standards and we've developed the tests. The tests, again, the items to be tested were built by Pennsylvania educators, both basic and higher education, so that we were making sure that the transition into higher education for those first math courses or literature courses or science courses found that rigor as the launch pad into our new standards. I do share the concern that there are people that are upset, and I am worried that they are upset for reasons that they don't need to be upset about if we could talk and understand what those specific Pennsylvania issues were. I can't answer for Florida in data collection. I can't answer for Massachusetts in adopting national tests. That's not happening here. So if there is a way to find out what the concerns of what Pennsylvania is doing, I'd be willing to talk to anyone because folks shouldn't have concerns not allayed if in fact they're unfounded. Now, will there be times when we have legitimate differences in what we are doing and the reality? Yes, and we hear that today on the use of the Keystones. But I believe it is the state's responsibility to have standards and then have those clear expectations and then measure exactly what those expectations are. Those two things should go together. It happens in the classroom as a teacher. I shouldn't be teaching something that I'm not testing for, or I shouldn't be testing for something I didn't teach. So it kind of flows down that way where, and to be good educators, to be a good accountable department, there needs to be that alignment between the expectations and the accountability. And
I'm not disagreeing with that aspect of it, and I know we're running behind, so I'll finish up. But just a more fundamental issue, in terms of dealing with stakeholders to develop this and implement it and roll it out, you talked about involving the teaching community, the education community. But I think the most important stakeholders are the families that are involved. And what I see here today, here and in the other two rooms, are families, not the other types of stakeholders. And clearly they're concerned, may not have been aware of other opportunities to attend hearings, may have been busy with their daily lives. And so I think it is just incredibly important on something as fundamental as how your child is going to succeed or fail in the world, that there be a greater attempt to engage the families, not through the prism of the teachers or others, but engage the families directly. And I would just encourage and ask you, as we move forward, to find an opportunity to do that in a formal way, and maybe you'll end up agreeing to disagree, but I think it's important that at least there is a feeling that they have been heard, and that perhaps some of the concerns, even if not all of them, but some of them can be addressed, and some misunderstandings be dispelled. So I would strongly encourage and ask you to find a way to do that.
thank you.
You're welcome, Senator Templitz. Thank you, Deputy Secretary. Next three that we're going to bring up is Neil McCluskey from the Cato Institute, Joy Pullman from the Heartland Institute, and Cheryl Boyce from the Commonwealth Education Organization. And I ask you to make sure that your green lights are bright green, and that you summarize because we're falling behind, and so we can get to the next testifiers, and so we can have the next panel discussion, that we will be able to just summarize your statements, highlight it if you could. Okay? I will let you, we'll go to Mr. McCluskey.
All right. Well, thank you very much, Chairman Fulmer, Chairman Dinniman. I have these all written out, so I'll try and give you as succinct a summary as I can about the Common Core, although it's good because a lot of things have come up just in the previous testimony that are important. So this may seem a little scattershot at this point, but let me get to the most important points. First of all, the thing we have to keep in mind is the role of the federal government in all this. And a little history on federal involvement is important. The federal government didn't really get involved in any meaningful way in education until the 1960s, 1965. Until then, school education was fundamentally local. Actually, before that, it was based in families and churches and things like that. Then it was local. So federal involvement is a relatively recent thing. And what we cherish, or tend to cherish in the United States and in Pennsylvania, I think, is local control of education. And inherently, this Common Core is removed from local control of education. A little more on federal history, I think, is also important. It wasn't until the late 1980s that the federal government began to ask states for evidence of some type of student performance of students linked to federal money. And then we heard that in 1999 was when the state of Pennsylvania, possibly of its own volition, adopted state standards. However, it's important to note that in 1994, the federal government passed something called the Improving America's School Act, which is really just the most recent reiteration or reauthorization of the Elementary and Secondary Education Act, and it required states, as a condition of receiving federal money, to have state standards. So I think we can see at least pressure from the federal government working on Pennsylvania for a long time. Which almost brings us to the national curriculum drive, but I want to add one other thing that the federal government almost did but fell short of doing in the 1990s. And that is, few states were really fully complying with the Improving America's School Act in the 1990s. Some were moving forward. many were sort of dragging their feet, and it wasn't until No Child Left Behind when the federal government said, okay, you really have to do this. But it was the law until 1994. In the 1990s, though, the first Bush administration proposed the creation of voluntary national standards and assessments and provided a small amount of funding to create those things. Now, if you think back to that time, if you have any recollection of it, when the standards were eventually released, because they were released before anybody was required in any way to adopt them, a national uproar occurred with the release of the very first standard. Nobody liked them. Everybody found something to dislike, and they ended up going nowhere. The idea that Washington should be behind standards or that there should even be some sort of national standards was hugely disliked, both the idea and the content that was presented to people. Again, people seem to much prefer national standards. So the question is how we suddenly ended up with 45 states having adopted something called the Common Core. Well, the No Child Left Behind Act was supposed to bring all kids to proficiency in math and reading by 2014. It became clear pretty early on that most states weren't going to be able to meet that 2014 deadline. It was also fairly clear that most states had pretty low standards and that these standards varied. And so in the face of this, two non-governmental organizations, and we hear that Common Core is state-led, but let's keep in mind, these two organizations are the National Governors Association, the Council of State School Officers. Those are not states. They don't represent states in any meaningful way. They set out to create, quote-unquote, internationally benchmarked standards in math and reading. This effort formally became the Common Core State Standards Initiative in 2009, and it's repeatedly characterized as state-led and voluntary. It's really been neither. Again, NGAA, CCSO are not states. They may be organizations to which state-level officials belong, but they don't represent states. More importantly, adoption of Common Core has not been in a meaningful way voluntary. From the outset, the Obama administration talked about the need for national standards. The 2009 stimulus bill gave them the lever by which to push that, the $4.35 billion Race to the Top program. To fully compete for Race to the Top money, states had to adopt standards common to multiple states, and only one set of standards fully met the definition. That was the Common Core. Common Core state standards. In addition, the U.S. Department of Education earmarked $350 million to develop tests to go with these standards. Ultimately, those became the people they commissioned, the Smarter Balanced Assessment Consortium and the Partnership for Assessment of Readiness for College and Careers. Finally, when issuing waivers to enable states to get out of this 2014 deadline that it was clear nobody was going to meet, one of two ways you could meet the requirements to get a waiver were either you had adopted the Common Core or you had your state, your biggest four-year state public college system certify your standards college and career ready. So you really only had two choices in that case. Now, it's been suggested that by supporters of Common Core that the Obama administration has really just overreached, and nobody ever wanted that. Nobody wanted a federal shove behind adopting these standards. But this is belied by a 2008, before there was an Obama administration, NGA CCSSO report called Benchmarking for Success, Ensuring U.S. Students Receive a World-Class Education. It explicitly calls upon Washington to provide, quote-unquote, incentives for states to adopt national standards. And that's precisely what Race to the Top was. It was coercion. It was an incentive using taxpayer money, including Pennsylvania taxpayer money. And they said, you know, essentially, it's no more voluntary than having a mugger take your money, Pennsylvania taxpayer money, then let you voluntarily, quote unquote, hand him the keys to your car to get your money back. That's not voluntary in any meaningful way. Now, maybe there'd be some good that comes from having national standards. Perhaps the ends justify the means. But that seems unlikely. The major arguments I've seen given when we've even debated the arguments, the empirical research behind having national standards, the first is that every country that beats us on international assessments has national standards. Ignoring for a moment the very important point that performance on exams does not necessarily indicate the effectiveness of an education system, and we need to keep that closely in mind. This factoid about everyone who beats us has national standards is meaningless when put into context. The reality is most countries that do worse than we do have national standards. So I could just as easily say to you, we don't need national standards because almost everybody who does worse than we do has them. There is no meaningful correlation between having national standards and a nation's academic performance. And then you can go into more rigorous empirical research, such as it is. I won't go into that in detail. But efforts to control for all sorts of student factors, as well as having tests or standards that are linked to high-stakes tests, like you're talking about with the Keystone exams, even having that, once you control for national culture, they found that none of those things matter. Culture seems to be the controlling variable. Now, more research needs to be done. This is hardly conclusive, but it does powerfully suggest that there isn't good empirical evidence supporting the idea that we need national standards. What we do need is school choice. You need to make it so that people have to respond to the people they're supposed to serve. And I think and there's good empirical research on this. Out of 150 statistical comparisons, Andrew Coulson at the Cato Institute found that market-like delivery of education outperformed government monopoly delivery by a ratio of 15 to 1. That's international assessments and national assessments. And Pennsylvania does have a good tax credit program that currently enables 45,000 students to attend private schools. Now, the next thing that's important, I'm sure, is that the state of Pennsylvania got $41.3 million from the federal government in round 3 of Race to the Top. And if you were to say no to Common Core, it's possible they would ask for that money back. And that seems like a big sum of money, but need to put it in perspective. That's $10.3 million per year because it's a 4-year grant. In contrast to that, in 2009-2010, this is the most recent federal data we have for Pennsylvania, total public elementary and secondary spending. The total spending according to the federal government is $26.5 billion. Now, this is capital costs, this is everything. So that grant is a mere 0.04% of that. That is a speck of dust relative to total spending. And you need to ask yourself, are you willing to sell control of what your schools teach for a speck of dust? Finally, we'll move on here so I don't take too much more time. You may think that, well, so we can always escape this. We implement the Common Core, and then in a couple of years, or 3 years, I think it is, once your grant runs out, well, then we can still pull out. But you have to be very concerned. You have to look forward to what the federal government may do. If the Elementary and Secondary Education Act is reauthorized, either this coming time, and it's already overdue, or subsequent times, and your annual funding is connected to having adopted national standards and national tests, you are now locked into Common Core, and it's not far-fetched this could happen. In 2010, the Obama administration released a blueprint for authorizing ESEA that placed college and career standards and common tests at the heart of its accountability provisions, including rewards and punishments for schools and districts and states. So even if the coming reauthorization doesn't directly link your annual appropriations to having national standards and tests, if most states have adopted these because of, in large part, coercion, then the next time around, you can easily see the slippery slope problem, where in Washington they say, well, look, everybody now has basically the same standards. It's not really a big leap to lock everyone into that. And we would have to look back several years at that point to say, oh, wait, there was a big controversy about these at the time. And then one last thing I think we have to talk about. I am not a content expert, so I'm not going to tell you that I am. What I can tell you is there is major disagreement among content experts about whether the Common Core is better or worse than Pennsylvania's current standards, whether it's better than the ideal standard. And the fact of the matter is, ultimately, we don't know. Barring omniscience, nobody knows for sure what the greatest standard is. Plus, all students are different. There may not be one best standard for everyone. But if we lock one into place, it's both unrealistic because all kids are different, and then you don't have competing standards where you can see, well, one works better than another. And it's absolutely crucial that you have that sort of competition, and you will not if you adopt Common Core. And it's also worth noting that Common Core only lets a state play with 15% of the standards. You get that, and Common Core gets 85%. So you can tailor only so much. So in summary, national curriculum standards the federal government coerced Pennsylvania into adopting are probably not the right answer for Pennsylvania, but it is not too late yet, I think, to rectify that situation. Thank you.
Thank you, and to the rest of the testifiers here, if you could just try to summarize so we can get to all the panels. Thank you very much. Joy Pullman. Make sure it's a bright green.
Hello. Thank you, gentlemen, for listening, senators, for paying attention to this important issue. As you know, I'm Joy Pullman, an education research fellow with the Heartland Institute, and I've been ditching parts of my testimony as Neil's been talking. So first, let me give you a few points of clarity. As Neil mentioned, Pennsylvania State Board of Education in March adopted a revised version of Common Core, which they call Pennsylvania Common Core, and it consists of the entire National Common Core plus 3 appendices. So I've read through that, as the Deputy Secretary suggested that people do, and I've compared the 2 documents. But basically, the regulations surrounding Common Core are such that any state additions may comprise no more than, as Neil said, 15% of the standards, and states must adopt the entire Common Core along with that, the national portion. So any criticisms, no matter what you call it, any remarks on the National Common Core apply in this situation, because students in Pennsylvania are going to encounter all of it, plus whatever things you decide to add. And second of all, I'll make some additions to what Neil has said about the misconception that Common Core is state-led. So there are the number of ways that the federal government has pushed states into this, but it's important, but basically that label is misleading. So the organizations that created Common Core are funded by the federal government, by private foundations, particularly the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, which actually funds all of the folks speaking on the opposing panel today as well, and big business organizations. So they're private trade associations that have no authority over states like the legislature does, but they insist that all governors and state school chiefs are members, even if those individuals, which 5 governors have done, publicly renounce their membership in the groups. So they make their decisions in private, and they don't publish the names of the people present or the positions that they've taken during discussions. And so while there are 135 really good-looking or good-sounding people listed as Common Core contributors, including only three from Pennsylvania, but they're from the University of Pittsburgh School of Education, people who actually sat on those committees alongside those folks actually told me they had no power over the outcome of writing. They gave their contributions to the panel, and the 4 lead writers of the standards took those into advisement, but nobody knows actually what considerations of theirs were actually put in the final standards unless they could find that from reading it. So there are really 4 folks, 3 of whom had never been teachers in any, well, there's one professor who wrote the standards, but none of them are from Pennsylvania. So I'll ditch a few more things. So in short, applying the phrase state-led to Common Core does not mean what most people would think when they hear it, and therefore I call that deliberately deceptive. So let's talk about, there has also been some discussion and concern, I think you probably in your town hall, Senator Smucker, have heard this from folks, the distinction between curriculum and standards. So Common Core proponents kind of want to have things both ways on this question, because curriculum experts such as the Fordham Institute's Kathleen Porter McGee believe that Common Core will lead to a literarily rich national curriculum, an improvement in the curriculum that kids encounter. But they also say standards are not a curriculum. So while being somewhat self-contradicting, that's actually semantically true. So standards function like a table of contents for curriculum, defining what will be tested and will not. So standards do not constitute, but they define curriculum. They provide its outline, and they also give the things that children will be tested on. So the Pennsylvania Board of Education recently put out a fact sheet on Common Core that says local school districts have complete control over what curriculum they will use to meet the standards, which reminds me somewhat like Henry Ford's legendary statement, any customer can have a Model T painted in any color that he wants as long as it's black. In the age of standards-based accountability, the state essentially determines what kids will be taught by mandating what will be tested, and we've, I guess, kind of agreed to that as well in this room throughout the discussion. So we can debate whether that's a wise arrangement, but you have to at least be honest and admit that whoever designs the test determines what children are going to teach, what schools that administer them, that have to administer them, are going to be teaching students. Okay, and actually the State Board clearly understand this because its March revisions to Chapter 4 actually state assessment in public education is designed to determine student attainment of state and local academic standards. Okay. Okay, so now that we're a little more clear on kind of what these standards will do and how they affect curriculum and the differences there, let's talk about whether that will improve student achievement, which is the whole point of most education reforms, at least I hope, and how Common Core feeds a vast expansion of invasive student data tracking. Common Core supporters typically avoid 2 preliminary fundamental observations about their pet project. The first is that there is no evidence that Common Core has ever benefited any student anywhere in the world because it has never been pilot tested like most state standards. It is entirely experimental. Second, the evidence that we do have, as Neil mentioned, so I won't go into it, in the last 30 years of standards-based accountability is not promising. Even if Common Core were academically superb, and it is not, the Brookings Institution has found no statistical relationship between a state having high standards and high student achievement. So again, Senator Smucker, when you're saying, you know, some improvement in some of the things that your children are bringing home or things from teachers, the evidence that we have from the past indicates that personal sampling is not as accurate as kind of a random sampling, and the random samplings in the past indicate that, you know, improvement somewhere is often counterbalanced by disimprovement elsewhere, meaning that, you know, we have no evidence that standards have actually ever led to an overall increase in the materials that children are given in school. And an analysis from Stanford University economist Eric Hanushek shows that states with higher standards actually tend to have lower student performance when they're compared on the same national test. As Neil mentioned, that's also true internationally. So there is actually no evidence that the massive increase in spending in standards-based high-stakes testing forced on states by the federal government has improved student achievement one whit, and I have a citation here for a great study on that in my paper. So let's move on to talking about the academic quality of the standards. So even if Common Core and standards had a good track record or any track record at all, what we know about standards demonstrates that Common Core is academically mediocre. So education leaders bought a pile of shiny labels for Common Core, which includes rigorous, college and career ready, and internationally benchmarked. And the evidence shows that all of these are completely untrue. All of the content experts on Common Core's own validation committee, which was supposed to certify that the standards lived up to these labels, they all refused to sign off on the standards because they believed that they did not meet those labels. So Stanford's James Milgram and the University of Arkansas's Sandra Stotsky were the only math and English content experts on that panel. 3 other folks also refused to sign off. But here's some of the things that they have to say about Common Core, which has been echoed nationally by other very well-respected voices. So Common Core's writers refused to provide evidence to the validation committee, its own validation committee, that research supports Common Core and that it is benchmarked to international bests, Stotsky notes. She also critiques the Core's hard-to-follow, low-quality English language art standards that constitute simply empty skill sets. Dr. Stotsky is directly responsible for Massachusetts standards, which were the highest in the nation and in the world before the state switched to Common Core. While Common Core shifts students to heavier doses of nonfiction, as we've also talked about, Stotsky writes from the research that there is absolutely no empirical research to suggest that college readiness is promoted by informational or nonfiction reading in high school English classes or in mathematics or science classes. Switching over to the math, by the end of 5th grade, this is a quote from Dr. Milgram, by the end of 5th grade, the material being covered in arithmetic and algebra in the core standards is more than a year behind the early grade expectations in most high-achieving countries. By the end of 7th grade, the core standards are roughly 2 years behind our international competitors. Former U.S. Department of Education official and mathematician Zev Werman says that core math standards would graduate students below the admission requirements of most four-year colleges. Coincidentally, one of the 2 Common Core lead writers in mathematics, Jason Dzimba, told the Massachusetts School Board of Education that this is true and that Common Core prepares students for a non-selective community college. Werman has particularly criticized that the Core pushes algebra back into grade 9, contrary to the practices of the high-achieving nations, the world's highest-achieving nations, which begin algebra in grade 8. Furthermore, the English Common Core's appendix claims to show how it compares internationally, but its international comparison consists of 3 statements. The math portion's international comparison consists of half a page and 5 bullet points and mentions no countries. Now we turn to the data tracking portion of the initiative, which is not mentioned explicitly in the standards, but which states agreed to in conjunction with updating their education standards. So they promised to implement certain data tracking agreements as well as better state standards when they received state stabilization funds from the 2009 stimulus. So I've actually read that for Pennsylvania. And former Governor Ed Rendell signed that in 2009, agreeing that Pennsylvania would establish a longitudinal data system and improve state academic content standards and student academic achievement standards according to provisions of another federal law called the America Competes Act.
So the relevant provisions there establish a database that will track children from preschool through the workforce, assign each child a unique identification number, provide student-level data about each child, so not these anonymous piles of grouped information that many schools are used to supplying and will tell you that's usually what they do. They will include demographic and academic data, track teachers and their student assignments, provide information on students who are not tested, which in several states has included private and homeschool students, and change state graduation requirements, standards, and tests to align them to post-K-12 demands. I wonder if that's why the State Board of Education is making all these changes to your graduation requirements. Pennsylvania's 2010 Race to the Top application says that the state has already accomplished all of these data tracking changes, and it says by 2013, Pennsylvania's student data system will have the ability to track students from birth to the workforce. It also states that Pennsylvania is using a 2010 federal grant to expand its database to track people in more ways. The National Center for Education Statistics has released an education data model for states to follow when doing exactly that, expanding those databases. It includes 416 data points on individuals, including invasive subjects like family religion, voting status, children's bus schedules, medical records, and more. The education data models, I'll skip that. So 3 recent changes make this much more invasive, actually. First, state databases under those same agreements that Pennsylvania signed with the federal government are now required to be interoperable with each other and open to the federal government, which makes them a de facto national database, which is illegal. Second, many people who know something about education data believe that it's protected by a federal law known as FERPA, or the Family Education Rights and Privacy Act of 1974. In 2012, the U.S. Department of Education rewrote that law to say that it or any educational agency, such as a state or school, may share student information with anyone that agency wants without consulting or notifying parents. So really, there is no longer very much federal student data protection. Third, in discussing student data and testing with Bluegrass Institute education analyst Richard Innes, I recently discovered that even what states believe is basic anonymous data they statutorily must collect about children is easily made personal. So in the 90s, Innes called out the Kentucky Department of Education for a jump in the number of students excluded from taking state tests, which caused higher overall student test scores. To attempt to prove him wrong, the department hired a researcher to extrapolate what scores the state tests the excluded kids would have got by pulling the results from the National Assessment of Educational Progress. One problem, NAEP scores are anonymous. That wasn't a problem. Simply by comparing basic demographic data from both tests, the researcher was able to reattach student names back onto their personal records with an 86% accuracy rate. And as you know, the database has only gotten bigger, which makes them more likely to be more accurate for releasing individual student information. So this shows that anonymous student data is really not anonymous, especially 20 years later with bigger databases, more data points, and more people getting access. Okay. I'll skip some more. So I just want to conclude with my last sentence here, which is that the last thing U.S. education needs is central control of what children will learn. Common Core is not state-led, it's not rigorous or internationally benchmarked, and it poses a grave threat to family, local, and state sovereignty. Pennsylvania should stop pursuing foolish slogans and let families and schools once again determine what they will teach and how. Thank you.
Cheryl Boyce, Commonwealth Education Organization. You're next. If you could summarize as quickly as you
I'm
could.
going to try to, but I represent the consumers, the educational consumers of the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania.
Is your microphone on bright?
Not on?
Bright green?
I'm
There you-
sorry.
it is
I
now.
think my paperwork was on top of it. I apologize. Senators, thank you for this opportunity. I'm really the person you were talking about. We were founded 20 years ago for the sole purpose of tracking what's going on in education. We have spent years, gentlemen, years before you even knew what a Common Core standard was following this. And I'm going to tell you what the consumers worried about in Pennsylvania. First of all, I was at the state board meetings. I would be happy to tell you what they do wrong. One of the things is that they have no clue what transparency is. You do not have a meeting in a building where you need a special access code to get in when it's a public meeting, and the public does not have the code to get in the building. That's a fundamental thing. I would be happy to discuss at length my experiences with the State Board of Education, which should be another hearing for another day. 21 members, largest in the country, doesn't have the They can't even answer questions. I sat through a meeting, they could not answer questions about the Common Core. That is a very sad state of affairs, and that should never happen. But let me tell you what I did in my research. One of the things that is very discouraging to me is that we're not having more hearings, because I went back through our files, and gentlemen, we have tons of files on everything you've done for the last 20 years. And I found a letter, and this is why we get skeptical when you say, we're going to get it right this time. This letter was written by Paul O'Neill, the CEO of Alcoa. Business says they're upset with these standards. You had business involved with the standards before. Paul O'Neill was the chair of the Standards Committee under Tom Ridge. So you had business input, and he said that we're creating a rigorous set of standards, the achievement of which demonstrates the attainment of high levels of student competency in core academic subjects. You've promised this before. You do the same thing over and over and over and expect different results. So as a consumer, as an educational consumer, you can understand our skeptics' feeling about why do you do the same thing over. He said one last thing. One of the frequent requests we received as we held our public hearings across the state was the standards we proposed be enduring, so the education community be spared the aggravation of constant change and thus be permitted to concentrate on educating the children. Here we go again. Now, because we're educational consumers, we went to the source and we wanted to go to people and say, we want you to analyze our standards, because we know you aligned them to the national framework. I was in the room when Pitt said that. And we have people, as Joy indicated, who refused to validate them. So we went to Dr. Stotsky, we went to James Milgram, we went to Zev Werman. We have staff in our office that talked to them, and we said, and I asked under Right to Know, I wanted to make sure we had all the standards, we wanted to know what we had, and we said, we want you to look at them. Now, Dr. Stotsky graciously gave you some testimony that's in the record about her analysis of the standards. Gentlemen, in one word, they think they stink. I would strongly suggest to you, you get an independent analysis of these standards, because you keep saying you're getting it right. And we have national experts who refuse to validate the Common Core standards, looking at the Pennsylvania standards, saying things like, who wrote these? You know, I mean, seriously, this is the emails we got back. I'm sure they won't mind us saying that in here. James Milgram said he called them an amateurish hack job littered with standards. He was the only mathematician on the national committee to validate the standards. He refused to do it. He looked at Pennsylvania standards. That's sad, and we're the ones that are paying for that. You have to remember that's why we're concerned. Dr. Stotsky wanted to know. She said, find out who was responsible for writing the standards. They were made worse. Now, you have to realize that these are people that have looked at standards everywhere. Zev Werman, who is a STEM person, science, technology, engineering, math, looked at these standards and said the same thing. He didn't even want to deal with them. He did not want to deal with them. I think we need to go back and see what we bought. I don't care who wrote them. I know the framework that was used. It was national. And we need to make sure that if we're going to do standards, and I agree, there has to be objectives. I don't care what you call them. We've called them outcomes. We've called them goals. We've called them everything, and we keep wrapping them in a different ribbon. But the reality is, we've always had objectives in the classroom. Always, even back in the day when I was in school. The question is, are they any good? Who wrote them? And shouldn't they be closest to the children? That's the question. One other thing, we have spent a ton of money in this state talking about early learning. The early learning community came out and said, these are not developmentally appropriate practices for K through third grade. That is very critical. I worked with young children. I also worked in private industry, so I'm looking at this from different perspectives. They're saying this is not developmentally appropriate practices. You need to look at that. First graders learn in a specific way. If these are not aligned to that, then you have a serious problem. I also want to ask you some questions. This is the race to the top. This is analysis of the race to the top. If you haven't read the contract, please read it. Because in here it says, I was horrified when I read the first one. The IRC did come out and say, and that's part of our process, that this is going to cost too much and this is hard to implement. Well, in the Race to the Top agreement, because, gentlemen, it's about what Pennsylvania's Department of Ed says to the federal Department of Ed. I don't care what they say to me. I want to know what they say to each other. And what they said in the agreement was, based on the timeline, that the Independent Regulatory Review Commission may not stop the standards process because of the grant money. They didn't really care. They said to the federal government, we don't care what the IRC says. We're going to continue with this process based on federal timelines. Everything that has been done has not been based on what's best for the kids. It's been based on a federal timeline. And they didn't even want to pay attention to the IRC. In addition, in Section A1 in the application, every school district in the state must update its instructional program to reflect the new standards, and they must use the state-mandated assessments. We anticipate that given the limited resources most districts had for curricular improvements, the overwhelming majority of our districts will rely on the SAS portal. Now, we just heard that that's the case, but guess what? If they have to rely on the portal, that means they're not doing local curriculum changes. And I want to know as a consumer, how is that going to work? Because right now, I can go in and look at curriculum, and if I don't like it, we can have this discussion in the school board. But if you're telling me that this is too expensive, they don't have the money to do this, and they're going to have to use something on the state website, how are you going to control that if there's something wrong? Because you sent to Washington, D.C., a piece of paper in July of 2012 that indicated you were asking permission from the federal government. Is it okay if we do this? If you have to ask the federal government, gentlemen, is it okay if we do this? You don't have control. And that's our fear. That is our fear. You have abdicated control to the federal government. This analysis of Race to the Top alone. The other thing that I don't get, and I would like somebody to explain to me, is the money. Because in this document it says, in Section A2, it says, using the funds for this grant as described in the state's budget, accompanying budget narrative, to accomplish the state's plan and to meet its targets includes where feasible. And they talk about reallocating and repurposing funds. And they're saying, the state is saying to the federal government, we're going to tell you we're going to use local sources of monies. I thought the last time I checked, school boards were responsible for local sources of monies, not the state. The state is telling the federal government we're going to use local sources of money. I know you have to, leave. One last thing. They're talking about the testing. We've had a lot of discussion about testing today. I gave Senator Fulmer's staff 4 letters. Pennsylvania is saying, oh, we're just sort of keeping an eye on these national tests. We're really not doing anything. I want you to explain this to me. There are 4 letters. They're to Arne Duncan, Secretary of Education in Washington, D.C. It's about PARCC, which is one of the 2 national testing consortia, and this is where the letters are from. The Pennsylvania Community Colleges, all 14 state universities, the University of Pittsburgh, and Penn State. And gentlemen, we're doing more than just keeping an eye on this. They're talking about PARCC. It says in here, these are the things we're going to be doing in relationship to that national testing consortia. I want to know, what are we really doing? Because we're doing something. They didn't sign. These letters read almost verbatim. And it outlines our involvement with PARCC, one of the 2 national testing consortia. I would like to know. I would like to know what we're really doing in that Race to the Top contract and agreement, and I would like to know what we're doing with this testing. Because I tell you what, there's something more going on here. And I think the public has a right to know. Thank you.
You're welcome. I appreciate the exuberance, but we do need to keep moving here, to be fair. And we're going to open up with some questions here, and we'll try to be real quick, and so we can get the next panel up, and so that we can get to the final discussion of both panels, so that we have a complete open hearing here. Mr. McCluskey, I have, I'm going to open up with yours, and my first question to you is, the two most common criticisms of Common Core I have heard from opponents are, one, the process to develop Common Core was flawed, and two, they could create problems in the future. Now, looking at Pennsylvania, and for myself, I'm just concerned about Pennsylvania here, as Common Core is presently proposed, what are the specific issues of concern with implementing Pennsylvania's Common Core standards for the year beginning in the fall of 2013?
Well, I mean, Pennsylvania, you know better than I do, has all sorts of issues. The root issue is that I think nobody, and this isn't just Pennsylvania, this is my observation in states around the country, most people have absolutely no idea what Common Core is. And the reason they don't know what Common Core is, and this is why the timeline is so important, Race to the Top told states you need to commit to adopting to Common Core before the final version of Common Core was even published. Every state did it, and keep in mind this is at the worst part of the recession. Every state did it, or almost every state, not every state, but almost every state applied for Race to the Top because they needed the money. And they said, we'll take Common Core without knowing what it is. And people are only now finding out what it is because it's now reaching their districts. So there are all sorts of problems that Pennsylvania and other states are going to face. What I would suggest is the way that you might move forward is perhaps do what Indiana did. Just pause for a moment and let people actually find out what this is. And once people can find out what it is, actually discuss it, and don't put yourself on a timeline where you have to do everything before you've seen what it is. And I think that that is really the root problem that has to be addressed.
Please, no applause, please. Joy, would you answer that same question, please? Should I repeat it?
Yes.
The two most common criticisms
Oh, yes, I heard.
of Common Core I have heard from my opponents, from the opponents, the process, one is the process to develop Common Core was flawed. Two, they would create problems in the future. Looking at Pennsylvania, and again, I stress Pennsylvania here because that's all I'm concerned about. As Common Core is presently proposed, what are the specific issues of concern with implementing Pennsylvania's Common Core standards for the school year beginning in the fall of 2013?
Well, one of the things that we haven't brought up yet, which kind of relates to what Cheryl was saying, is that I looked at the agreement that the Pennsylvania Department of Education signed with the federal government through PARC, and it does say that the state will implement smarter balance tests through 2015. It commits to doing that. So if that agreement has been broken, I haven't been able to find that, but that's another one of those things that you all need to pin down pretty fast. It's an agreement through PARC, which is one of the federally funded. You agreed to use the PARC test through 2015.
That is fascinating, Mr. Chair. On competitive bid.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's what the department has committed to us. This contract is committed to use one of the persons before we did competitive bidding, then that.
I mean, that's what the contract literally says, and I'm happy to send that to you, highlighted if you'd like.
Yeah, if you could send that would be very, very important. And just real quick for both of you, true or false? A number of other states that previously adopted Common Core have begun to back off, and some of them have outright repealed Common Core in their respective states. If true, what are the states who have backed off, and what were some of the reasons for the abandoning Common Core? Do you have that information?
Yeah, I think the answer is false, actually. I don't know of any states that have adopted have backed off. Indiana has hit a pause, and several states are now working generally through their legislatures, efforts to at least pause it, perhaps to get out of it. But no state that has entered has formally withdrawn.
Thank you. Do you want to make a comment to that?
Oh,
Joyce?
sure.
You
There are
don't have
about
to, you don't want
14
to.
states that have kind of reconsidered. And the big reason that we're kind of seeing a 3-year later response is that this is the first time that most legislators or the people have actually heard about it. Because, as I mentioned, the process was behind closed doors, funded by special interests, and not actually state-led. You know, the people didn't have a chance to be like, whoa, I saw this, I don't like it beforehand. So, but it's only fitting that they get that opportunity at some point, even if it has to be on the back end because of the designs of the folks who are trying to rush it through.
And my last question is to you, Cheryl, and I hope it's a fair question, and because I believe if we're going to be opposed to something, we need to have an answer to it, right?
Right.
I think that'd be the right thing to do, correct? If Common Core were to be rejected, do you have recommendations for how to measure student achievement so that the taxpayers know that their investments in public education are resulting in graduates who are ready for either the workforce or college? And again, just try to be specific with your recommendations.
Well, I'm glad you asked that question. We could probably do about 5 hours. I have a lot of suggestions, having worked with children and in business. First of all, you were told a long time ago, you being the legislature, that one of the worst things you could possibly do is put in place the PSSA. You had something that was much more valuable, and Senator Smucker has been very involved, I know, with the PVAS, the Value-Added Assessment System. We need to get back to basic. What you're doing is you're having schools and teachers teach to the PSSA. We need the good old-fashioned Iowa, California, so we're all on the same page. The parents and the teachers need to work as a team. We need to have the same information. Do you realize there's 3 key things in the educational process? The student, the teacher, and the family supporting that. And what you keep doing is you come up with bureaucratic solutions that is creating more of a wedge and is not allowing us to do our jobs. So we need that kind of data. We need to better go back to basics. That PSSA, the reason you're adding a new layer, because you keep adding layers of bureaucracy, the reason you're adding layers here is because the PSSA is not getting you what you want. You know, learning is a cumulative process. So if the child doesn't have their basic things, and the University of Pennsylvania did a study actually about these standards, and they said one of the problems is when you build a house, you worry about the foundation. The problem is this foundation is not getting what you want with these standards. So you need better testing. You need to really look at this whole process and really see what are these standards? Are they any good? Because to be honest, gentlemen, looking at a lot of things in other countries and other cities and everything, there's one key factor that makes a difference, and that's the people that work with these kids. And the parents and the teachers, that's where the difference is. You want standards? I know a lot of colleges in the state of Pennsylvania that could do with some adjustments of their standards in those colleges of education. I would really look at that.
Well, thank you. I'm going to turn over to Senator Dinniman. And Senator,
I'll be brief.
Okay.
In my definition of brief, you'll have to
All things are relative with Andy, remember?
All things are relative. That's why Mike and I are good buddies. I was more excited, and perhaps I should have been, but these issues are so crucial. Mike.
Oh, no, is
You mean I have to talk louder for a change? These issues are so crucial. And I want to make it clear, you know, the Democratic caucus, we understand the importance of standards, okay? And I'm not even sure that how much I disagree with Common Core standards. But what we're concerned about is this, and by the way, we also understand accountability. And it appears that in this case, we're not the tax and spenders either. But what we are concerned about is this, and we haven't talked much about it, that as you up the standards, we have literally tens and tens of thousands of poor kids in this Commonwealth, English language learners. And you know, by the standards, if I'm not mistaken, if you're in the United States less than 300, you have to be in the United States over less than a year, or you have to take the test. So literally, we're having students who can't understand the language take the test, and then the school being accused as failing. So we and our concern was that if schools can't even open, if more and more school districts are going bankrupt, if the city of Philadelphia is barely surviving, never mind Common Core textbooks, we might not have any textbooks there. You might not even have many teachers. You got rid of the librarians, the nurses, the counselors. If that's occurring, then any required graduation tests will only become an excuse to say those schools have failed. And that's not fair to the teachers. And it's not fair to the students either. You know, everyone in this Commonwealth, whether you're rich or poor, cares deeply about their child and wants their child to succeed. The truth in this Commonwealth is based on your zip code and based on the taxing ability of your particular school district will determine that. So before we put in tests, our caucus is simply saying, make sure, A, you understand the fiscal impact and the unfounded mandates, and B, put the resources into those schools, especially those poor schools, so the students can reach the standards, so the students can pass the test. And that's what we find lacking, that we haven't heard our educational organizations that are here tonight, who have spoken about the needs for us financing education. Now, all of a sudden, it's as if through magic, the standards are going to be, and all these kids will be educated. And it's not going to happen. As Senator Fulmer said so well in the beginning, that what happens is the nails are there, there's another set of tires, and they're going to blow once again. And what we really need in this Commonwealth is a discussion of educational reform based on the three principles you stated. Teachers are not to be ignored. They are important. Family, we encourage it. And ultimately, the whole community should be encouraged so we can all work together. But let me ask a couple of questions now that I've made my statement. Tell me something. What's the role of Bill Gates? Is it true that they've given $150 million to get these into operation, and that Pennsylvania, including the business group that is here today, including other organizations, have received, our own Department of Education has received significant funding? And if so, what?
It is true, and I actually did that research before the Washington Post did. Actually, Bill and Melinda Gates have given $163 million to Common Core initiatives across the country, as well as funding the part of the original creation of Common Core, the NGA and SSO's work. So I actually have the dollar figures on all of the folks.
I mean, everyone, of course, does things for good
Yes.
purposes, for philanthropy. But is there money to be made out of all this, whether it be Gates or whether it be the computer people? Because what it almost appears is happening is that there's two consortium that are going to make billions out of testing 50 million kids every year. And is that a concern? Because I was so surprised when you read that letter and told us.
Textbook and testing companies are expecting a bonanza of taxpayer dollars because they now have a national market for all of their products.
And you know, Senator, the thing that can disturb me looking at the Race to the Top agreement, when I'm looking and I see in there, and there's a reference to Bill and Melinda Gates' money commingled with our tax dollars with no level of accountability. See, he can put the money in, and he's done this before with other projects, and then he gets, when it doesn't work, he gets to say, oops, and he gets to walk away. But then we're left with the end result because it's our children in our schools. You know, that's a real concern about accountability, because he did it with the small school project and he walked away from it. And he's doing this again. And, you know, it's very nice that he gives money. Personally, I'm going to write him a letter after this hearing and suggest he creates his own schools. And he can experiment to his heart's content. And if he comes up with any good ideas, he can call us and let us know. But he is commingling his money with our tax dollars. And I don't know about you, but that makes me very uncomfortable.
Let's talk about let's talk about, I know, it's not liquor. Well, though, the solution, though, as you know, the solution is that, unfortunately, the administration talks about it is more booze and less schools. But that's another topic for another day. But if we're going, and because supposedly we're pretty bad as a society when we have to depend on cigarettes and booze to support our public education system. But that's, again, another topic. But the point is this. We talked about privacy. I just read that in Las Vegas at the recent computer show, and maybe you can help me understand this, and help our committee understand this, that there's this whole new computer system, and I believe Gates might be involved and some others are involved in this, and 7 states have already signed on to it, that has everything commingled together. And while our state says that we guarantee privacy, and you're quite right about federal policy. It allows any private contractor who's working for the school, that was changed in 2012, you're right, to have access to these documents. Well, if I want to make a mint, I just say there was a security leak, and companies will pay me billions of dollars for this information, because now I know on their, if I want to help Johnny Reed, I might know he's interested in baseball. So that's supposed to be good because I can help him read. Maybe it is, but it also means how I can market selling things to his parents. So can you tell us about this new system?
Yes, I actually cut that out of my testimony. It's called In Bloom, and it's funded exclusively by the Gates Foundation. So 9 states, not including Pennsylvania right now, but Pennsylvania does have the power because of those changes to federal law, have submitted all of their student records to a private database that includes hobbies, medical records, Social Security numbers, and they, say, I don't have any problem with people earning money, making people's lives better, but they should do that with full consent of those who own the records. And one of the recommendations that I make to states is to, because the federal law does not protect children anymore, states should make sure that children's data is protected.
Well, one of the most interesting things we found out on the Education Committee last year is that the state system of higher education, because of the longitudinal studies, was giving information to the state and to the PD and these studies without ever telling the students or their parents. Now, in this case, the students were over 18 years old. As a parent, I can't go in and get my kid's grade, but the university can hand it over without asking anyone. And we were amazed. In fact, I think I remember Senator Piccola, we then threatened the state system a little, and they agreed to notify the students if they continue to do this.
And also these records, I also cut out of my testimony some information from a psychologist to refute all of these changes and additions to student records nowadays. And these include, in many cases, psychological profiling. Many schools with their counselors, they work with criminal justice systems. There is very, very personal information in these databases, and it shouldn't be something that follows a child around for the rest of his life.
In fact, the reason I became aware of this was the intellectual disability community in our county came to me out of great concern that their kids' information would be which they thought was private with the school, would go on to a national database and the risk of it going elsewhere, despite all our promises to respect the dignity of that individual with intellectual disabilities. In the end, all that what I happen to believe that Pennsylvania should do exactly what Indiana is doing. We should pause. Our secretary has left us. It gives us a perfect time for us to re-examine this. We should pause long enough to ask the questions about physical impact on our schools, local schools, to make sure our kids aren't being used as guinea pigs since we don't have all the data in. We're not saying get rid of it. We're not saying end it. We're simply saying pause. I think Indiana's example is a model. And by the way, that was a bipartisan effort in Indiana. I believe the state superintendent of instruction won an election as a Democrat, and she and Governor Pence, who's a rather conservative Republican, came together and said it's in the interest of the kids, it's in the interest of the state that we simply pause. And by the way, this is the same position of the American Federation of Teachers. The American Federation of Teachers is not saying to get rid of Common Core standards. And they, by the way, received over $1 million from Bill Gates to be part of this. I mean, $1 billion, not quite $1 billion, but about $10 million, to be part of this. They're not saying end it. They're saying, listen, our teachers are telling us we don't understand the curriculum. Our teachers are telling us we can't teach it if we don't understand it. And you're going to institute a series of tests for graduation on our students, and we don't even know exactly what we're teaching, and in addition to that, these students are going to be labeled failures on a curriculum that we're not prepared yet to fully implement. And so I do think a pause, and that's the position of our caucus. And in fact, we have asked the governor of the Commonwealth in a letter that both Senator Teplitz and I signed, to simply pause, all 23 members of our caucus, to pause and answer the questions. This isn't pro, or this isn't anti-Common Core as it exists. It's a pause. And we also have put in a piece of legislation, which we put in yesterday. If the governor is not going to pause, when we have raised the questions that have been raised today, including the whole issue of standardized testing and its implications, and said we legislatively have put it in, that legislatively we will pass a pause. Now, we have the 23 Democrats. We get 3 of our friends from the other side who agree, and the legislation will be on its way. So I just wanted to ask you one question. Do you believe that this is a good thing to do at this stage of the game? Should we be pausing? And it doesn't mean we pause for years. Just pause to figure out what's going on. I mean, after all, this is affecting the education of every single child in this Commonwealth. This is not a minor thing. How do you feel about that? And what's your opinion?
Well, since I'm the only resident of Pennsylvania sitting at this table, I will tell you you're absolutely correct. That's what we were hoping for. But beyond that, we'd like you to communicate with the other states to find out what they're doing, because I know you think it's just a Pennsylvania issue. It clearly isn't. Just to let you know that we've talked to people in Congress to update them and see where they're at with that. I would suggest you get with Pennsylvania Congress people, and because you've got people already in the Senate in Washington that are trying to stop the funding for this, because how best to stop it is to cut the head of the snake off, and that's the money, because they also have questions about what we're getting ourselves into. So I think there needs to be communications on a couple different levels, and clearly Pennsylvania needs to stop and say, what are we doing? Because there are school board members behind me who will tell you that in their districts, maybe some of your districts are different, but their districts are clueless. They absolutely don't understand this. And not only the school boards, but the administrations. I was sitting in a school board meeting, and I have to tell you, by the time I left there, and you have to figure I've had 5 years of tracking this, I looked at their faces, and I could see why they were confused. We have to start back from square one. We do.
I appreciate your answer, and let me just say that I dare say when I talk to members of the legislature, they don't understand it either. Because you have to understand, there was originally a bill not to do Common Core by Senator Ori. In fact, every single Republican senator had signed on to that bill, it's -2. Now, and I had signed on to the bill, and one other Democrat. Now, that bill was never put past because of the commitment that was made by the administration that it would be 1/3 of the course. We wanted to do that as a compromise so that the classroom remained predominant and the teacher still was the one doing the evaluation. And unbeknownst to many, many people in the legislature, many of the legislators still assume that it was the agreement that was reached in 2010. Our complaint in one of our caucus is we believe that in legislative authority. We believe that a department should not be changing these issues without coming back to us as a legislature. And this is a whole nother issue of bureaucrats making the decision without proper legislative authority. The Constitution of Pennsylvania, which Mike carries in his pocket day in and day out, and much to his credit, I'm going to start to carry it too, Mike. It clearly says that the authority rests in the legislature, all right?
Yes.
It doesn't rest in the Department of Education. It doesn't rest, and when we made an arrangement that was rejected, and when you're telling me that there's even things that were signed with the federal government saying that we have to test through one of these consortium, then that's all done without any legislative knowledge, and no other reason. The rest is just so the legislature can figure out what it is, and it'll be good for us to read the contract that we've now obligated, that we now obligate hundreds of thousands of students in Pennsylvania to abide by.
I think the taxpayers would be thrilled if you read the contracts. and also look at the standards and decide, are they better? Are they really good? Are they going to help the students? And I think that needs to be looked at, and I'm sure that we can get some names of some people that are very happy to review those standards for you and determine how well of a job that Pennsylvania did in putting this all together, because ultimately the kids will pay the price if this is not done correctly. So thank you.
Senator Smucker.
Thank you. Appreciate the testimony by all of you. Appreciate the interest in quality of education here in Pennsylvania. And you certainly have raised a number of issues that I think need to be looked at, some issues that I hadn't heard before in regards to the implementation of Common Core. I wish I had time for a lot of questions. I don't. I just have a few clarifications and questions. So if, in your view, if we don't do Common Core, do we do some testing or we do some standards? Do you feel testing and standards are necessary at all?
Oh, absolutely. That's why I made the comment about the Iowa Achievement Test. I think what you don't realize is that parents play a key part. What really happens is the people in the lives of the students are very important, and they have to be on the same page. So testing allows us to be on the same page. But the PSSA does not give you the kind of information that we used to get, because I was a parent when you made that transition, and I have to tell you that I knew a lot about how my child was performing based on an achievement test. I knew the weaknesses and strengths. Don't assume that parents are not part of this process.
I'm going to interrupt you because we need to move on, and I appreciate that. I think a discussion about what are the best tests, I think, is a very good one to have.
Yes.
So I agree with you on that point. And I also, while we're on that topic, appreciate your reference to PVAS as well.
Yes.
But I would point out that PVAS is only a different way of slicing and dicing the PSSA information. Mm-hmm. It simply takes the PSSA information in a given year and compares it to information of the testing in previous years and measures the progress, which I think is necessary, because schools, really a teacher in a classroom, a school doesn't have control over which level students are at when they get there,
right.
But they still should be held accountable to advancing that student at least a year. So that's what PVAS is, but to be
right.
clear, it is based on the PSSA system. So would you answer that question as well? Do you think we should have testing of any sort or standards? And/or standards?
I think there are two wise options. The first one is standards and testing that are correlated with them, that are clear. Everyone knows beforehand what's expected to be taught. And I think an important thing for that would be independent evaluations of the tests for psychometric things that folks are starting to put into tests. So I know that teachers and parents cannot see all the item banks because that compromises test security, but you need to have folks who know about that, independently checking that, before you put it in. The other option. So
you question the quality of the standards and the tests that we have in place now. I know you don't want them on the federal level. Mm-hmm. Do you think we should establish standards at the state level?
Like I said, there's two options. I do think that's a viable option. Lots of states have chosen that, but as I mentioned, the research is very mixed on that. So the second option that worldwide is showing, and in the United States is showing very good accountability for the money that states spend, is school choice that Neil talked about, and he knows all the studies.
I agree with that.
Yeah.
If you would know, if you've been involved in education here in Pennsylvania, that would been one of the outspoken proponents
I think you
of school
do
choice.
one while you're waiting for the other to phase in.
And I think that would be a great solution to a number of issues, and I think would raise the rigor of education both in the public schools as well as private schools and across the board. So I'm with you on that, and I appreciated that point. I was a private business owner for a while, and for actually many years prior to serving in this role. One of the things that was most helpful to me was doing what we called sharing best practices. So I would look at similar companies across the country and find businesses that were addressing common issues most effectively, and you try to put those to practice here. And I'll be frank with you, when I heard about the state's adoption of these, I saw it as somewhat similar. We shared information with other states and looked for areas that had the best curriculum, and then even when we and there's a long list of educators here in Pennsylvania who then looked at the Common Core and chose to adopt some parts of it and not others. And so I guess that's the way I view this. I know that you had said earlier that what was the association, the Governors Association? Mm-hmm. You made a comment that's not a state, and so how can they be speaking for the states? Wouldn't that be like saying here, the Pennsylvania Township Association of Supervisors, for Township Supervisors, isn't a township because it doesn't speak for the township supervisors? I frankly don't get that at all. Well, that would not make the Township Supervisors Association a state organization or speaking for the state in any way. So I didn't understand that comment.
Well, because the National Governors Association isn't a legislature. It doesn't represent people. It's not elected. The people who are in the NGA, if they sign on to something the NGA does, it doesn't become law the way that you go through a normal political
just like
process.
The Township Supervisors Association
Absolutely.
Here.
So it is disingenuous to call this state-led when these are not states. These are associations of state officials.
But I could make that same point. You know, I have a lot of interaction. I was a township supervisor at one point and a member of PSAT. So that would be like saying that the initiatives by the Township Supervisors Association are not township-led. It doesn't make sense. Well, I'm going to go on. In terms of the, and I'm only doing that for time. I'd love to talk more, but I need to clarify this point as well. In terms of the adoption, the quick adoption without even knowing the standards, I'll tell you what I've been told, and I want to get your comments on this. This particular set of standards, the Pennsylvania Common Core, was adopted by the Board of Education in 2010, is what I've been told. In fact, we just heard the Secretary say that. That, to me, doesn't seem to be a rush to adopt the standards. And, in fact, the school superintendents that I've spoken to are well aware of this and have been well aware of it for the last 3 years. Do you disagree with that?
Well, because the final version of the standards was released in June of 2010. Is that really enough time for not just the school board, but the people they represent to see those standards, to digest those standards, and to debate those standards? And it's got to be remembered that the federal government was asking before that publication for states to commit to the Common Core. So I think if you look at the timeline, there's little question that the federal government would say, sign these now, or sign up for these now, look at them later. And if we really want the people of the state to know what they're getting, they need more time than either no months or 1 month or 2 months.
Again, I have a lot of additional questions, and I know we just don't have time, but one additional one. Is there a database in Pennsylvania where we're collecting information about individual students on a statewide basis?
Yes, your Department of Education told the federal government that in a 2010 application for Race to the Top funds.
Okay. That's something I want to check into. That's information I hadn't heard before. So thank you very much again for being here.
Thank you very much for your testimony. We're going to bring up the next set of panelists in support of Common Core. And they are, excuse me, I lost my place, Joan Benzel from the Pennsylvania Partnership for Children, Dave Patty from the Pennsylvania Business Council, and unfortunately Major General Dan O'Neill could not be here at the hearing today but did submit written testimony. And we will go, whoever wants to go first.
I'm going to totally abandon my testimony in the interest of time. David and I are Pennsylvanians. We both work in this state capital. We see you all the time. We're happy to talk to you way more any day. So I would like to sort of share some of my perspectives, answer some questions you raised, and, you know, debunk some myths that came up that I hadn't even heard before today. So, Senator Schmucker, yes, Pennsylvania has a student information system. It does not collect or disaggregately report the kind of data that was referenced today. It doesn't have hobbies. It doesn't have religions. What it does allow now, I'll give you an example. Many of you know my organization does a lot of work in child welfare and foster care reform. And so now in Pennsylvania versus 5 years ago, when a child is placed into foster care and they live in Lancaster County and they're placed in neighboring Chestering County, the school district can actually look up that child's records. What a bad idea. That child doesn't have to say to that school district, you know, I actually took Algebra 1 last year. So data isn't our enemy, it can be our friend. The question about rushing to these standards, Deputy Secretary Dumaris noted in her testimony, I believe, and I will reinforce that, yes, we adopted the Common Core academic standards in July 2010. We gave school districts 3 years to comply. We just gave them 2 more this January. And none of the graduation requirements that Senator Dinniman likes to speak to, and he and I have both been great supporters of historically, take place till the graduating class of 2017. Not next year, not next week, not next month. When, we did hear that contradiction between, are our standards too high or are our standards too low? Where are they? When the crosswalk was done of Pennsylvania's past academic standards before July 2010, we found the University of Pittsburgh's evaluation demonstrated that basically we're in pretty good shape in elementary school, we got in trouble in middle school, and we went in the tank in high school. So I'm really confused by people who are both concerned the standards are too low and they're too high. The standards are the floor. And Senator Dinniman knows that my organization has worked aggressively for many years in support of adequate and equitable funding for Pennsylvania's public schools, which we do not believe is currently the case. However, we do a disservice to children in this state if we don't even have the expectation for the same floor for them every day. And that's why we support the Common Core academic standards. One of the things, I'm a parent. I sent 2 children through, actually, the Cumberland Valley School District. So our new Secretary of Education is my superintendent. And I have to say that I have great admiration and respect for Secretary Tomales and enjoyed working with him over the last 2.5 years. He's a good public servant and did a great job. What I think is important for all parents to understand is one of the driving forces behind why we began to do this. Here's the Pennsylvania data. 45% of our students graduated from high school in 11-12. Not being able to meet with my national colleagues and my state colleagues tell me are abysmally weak state standards. 45% of them, and they're in every school district in the state. Clearly disproportionately higher in school districts with poverty, with English language learners, and higher concentrations of students with disabilities. 45,000 students. That's about 1 in 3 of every Pennsylvania school students. So will someone tell me how we're going to have a thriving economy ever if this is what we do? Another Pennsylvania statistic. 1 in 3 students who enroll in a Pennsylvania state-funded community college or PASHE school cannot pass first-year math and English courses. They have to take remedial courses in post-secondary education using probably an estimate of more than $26 million in tuition fees and tax dollars a year. We have a problem, people. And while we all wait for everyone to agree and to vet more children in our state graduate from high school ill-prepared, more children in our state go on to have to compete against kids in Ohio and China, and more kids are done a disservice. So while we work hard to win more money, we cannot say that it is okay for a student in the Harrisburg School District to not be expected and to not have the adults that work with that child every day have the same set of expectations of the students who live 7 miles away in my Cumberland Valley School District. That's just unfair to kids. And we are the independent child advocacy organization in Pennsylvania who's been in business for 20 years on a whole array of issues. I want to point to a comment that was made by Major General O'Neill, who couldn't be with us today. And I think it's just excellent. It sums it up so well. He's a skilled aviator. He's a decorated veteran. His comment is, my check ride for instrument certification was not when he became a pilot, was not a Pennsylvania test or a New York test, but it was an international test. When a pilot begins to land an airplane, we all hope he learned by some set of common standards, not by an individual state standard. And that's exactly why Common Core makes sense. Just as Deputy Secretary Dumas said to you earlier, Common Core is not a curriculum. Common Core is not instructional practice. The members of this legislature know that my organization has been instrumental in our state's commitment to early learning. Developmentally appropriate practice is practice. It's instructional strategies. It's curricula elements. It's not child learning outcomes. And the early childhood community in this state actually supports the pre-K standards we're putting into these academic standards. You know, our long history of local control should not be compromised. It's a good thing. But we need to be sure that we set expectations and accountability for all those dollars we spend as taxpayers. Our standards can't be stagnant. I'm looking at the four senators still sitting with us, and I'm going to venture to guess that, you know, I'm a little more aligned in age with that senator there, and we get a little younger on that end. So when I went to college, there was a building we went to use the computer, or the computers, and I went to Penn State University. So I got to imagine by the time Senator Teplis went to college, maybe not, maybe, you know, but clearly by the time the executive director of the committee sitting behind Chairman Jen Schmelz went to college, she probably had a computer. So if we let our standards sit for long periods of time, you'll back to me using a slide rule in calculus. That would not make sense. We need to continue to grow our expectations. I want to talk to one piece of the cost, because a number of national groups have put out data that says Pennsylvania has to spend $600 million to implement these standards. That assumes we're in the National Education Consortia, which costs $280 million in technology estimates to automate tests. Keystones and PSSAs are available in paper and pencil for 100% of Pennsylvania school districts. It suggests that $115 million of that $650 will be attributed to new textbooks. I agree school districts are trimming curriculum and not buying textbooks quickly, but now we're going to give them 5 years to catch up, right? That money is already embedded in budgets. It suggests we're going to need $250 million for professional development. We spend $500 million in professional development a year in Pennsylvania. And what are we spending it on? If we are not spending it on making sure our teachers understand the instructional practices, the curriculum, and the elements that will help our kids be ready. I spoke a little bit about the data piece. Let me close by just saying here's the bottom line from our perspective. Pennsylvania children don't get another chance to redo their childhood. When we have enough money, or everyone agrees, or we all figure out what we think the perfect standard and the perfect assessment is. And we do Pennsylvania school children, I will say as a child advocate and as a parent, an enormous disservice if we allow them to be relegated to the zip codes they live in. And one of the ways we fix that is by high expectations for them all. And I will make one comment about my organization's funding by the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, and I would urge my young colleague from the Heartland Institute to do a little more homework. The first time we ever received a grant from the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation that supported Common Core was last month. Our prior funding from the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, about $700,000 over 5 years, has been primarily available to support our work that we ask them to help us finance to assure that teachers are more effective and more accountable for the outcomes of children. And I find it quite ironic and disheartening that last year when the legislature overwhelmingly supported our work to assure that children in foster care can stay in foster care past age 18, no one asked me, why did Casey Family Programs, also based in Seattle, Pennsylvania, and the largest child welfare foundation in the country, did they fund me? Guess what? They fund me more. So thank you. I'm happy to ask questions. I know people want to get to the 3:45.
Oh, we're not going.
No, we're not going. This is too important, so we're...
But
That's why I took
I
my
want
jacket
Dave to
off,
go.
man.
Now I get to read my text.
Yeah, no. I was going to tell you that, but you were on a roll, so...
No, I just figure, I mean, we've had these conversations, and much of what's in my written testimony is repetitive. I just think it's better to get to the point.
Mr. Patty.
Thank you, Senator, and to all of you, gentlemen. I appreciate the time. And I'm going to do the same thing, not stick to the written remarks. You certainly have the capability of going through those, although I'm happy to take questions if you want to. And that was really looking at some polling data. But it's interesting in thinking through, as we've had some time to do this afternoon, I think next Monday I hit my 29th anniversary from starting upstairs in this building as a policy analyst for the Senate Republicans once upon a time. And one of the first assignments I got in the summer of '84 was to look at job training programs and the problems we were having getting educated workers. So it's a long process. It's a conversation that's been going on for a long time. Ms. Boyes mentioned that. In fact, she and I had the opportunity to have a discussion on Common Core a few weeks ago in public together, and she started that presentation by talking about how we probably agree on more than we disagree on, and I think that's still true today. There are a lot of people concerned about the quality of education in Pennsylvania, and there are a lot of moving parts, of which the standards, which lead to the curriculum, which leads to the instruction in classrooms, are one part. Funding is a part. The assessments are a part. There are a lot of different parts. Today we're talking about the standards, and I'll limit my remarks to that. But Senator Smucker summed it up well when he talked about the discussion that kind of spills over and mixes some of the issues. I would just underscore, while I'm an econometrics person more than a language person, I did do that well enough to know there's a difference between standards and standardization, and I see those words getting mixed a lot in this debate. And I think that Joan did a good job of talking about these are standards. To your hamburger analogy, a standardization says they all have the same things on them. Standards say the beef's going to be this fresh. And that's what we want. We want to know where the beef is, if I can go back to 1984. The importance for us, in fact, in that, and this goes to Paul O'Neill, I helped write standards for environmental education in the 90s for the Commonwealth. In business, we have what we call continuous process improvement, where no matter how good you are today, we believe you can be better tomorrow. And that's exactly what the Commonwealth adopted in the 90s when they said, yes, we're going to have academic standards, and we're going to review them every couple of years. That's the same thing we do in business practices. So it is a reason why the business community has embraced standards, not starting in, depending on when you want to date Common Core, because certainly 2010 was when Pennsylvania adopted it. But there are documents that you can get from the various NGOs and the non-governmental organizations. Really, you can see the precursor of Common Core in 2004, 2005, 2006. Part of it being, look, hey, that No Child Left Behind thing, maybe that's a fad. Oh, we'll see if President Bush even gets reelected in 2004. And then there was this governor from Florida who said, well, now that he's reelected, I'm pretty sure he's serious about this. We ought to do something. And Jeb Bush led others through the National Governors Association to start getting active. And he and Tim Pawlenty and some Democrat governors got together and started the process. The business community was in the room then, continues to be. You heard about some other groups. Achieve. Achieve is an organization that I hope someday will be my membership list because it's the largest corporations in America. Lumina is a group of university people and people associated with higher education who obviously want to make sure young people are educated well enough to move on to higher education. National Governors Association, I share Senator Smucker's view that those sorts of NGOs are important. And let's remember, in terms of non-governmental organizations, associations, philanthropy groups, whatever you want to call us, so is the Heartland Institute, so Cato, and we actually are somewhat incestuous. Heritage Foundation has used me on things, as has the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. I've hired Norm Ornstein and others from the American Enterprise Institute. We're moving things and knowledge and information back and forth between each other all the time. In terms of the funding, I won't go into that in great detail, but also we have more funding than what you heard about today. We had funding from the Gates Foundation prior, and I don't know if this will dig me a deeper hole, but I also have funding from Koch Industries, the Koch brothers. I mean, organizations like ours attract funding from lots of sources. Let me make an analogy for you, though, that I think is important, because I take your side collectively all the time. I bristle when people say, oh, Senator so-and-so is only voting for that because he got a PAC contribution from somebody. And that's nonsense, and we all know that. The reason that there's alignment is because people first see what you think, know what your values and your philosophies are, and say, I need them to stay there in the game. I need them to stay in office. I will help with their political side as well. Well, the same thing happens to us in the association world. People see our values, see what we've worked on, understand our competencies, and then come to us and say, could you do even more with a contribution? And of course, the answer is yes. In terms of the expenses, you heard Joan talk a little bit about a lot of the assumption being that we would be using the computer-based assessments. And I will tell you, I kind of came to this first thinking that the two national consortia had some good ideas, and it was now former Secretary Tamales who convinced me otherwise, and said he really wants to stay the course with Keystones. The document that you heard about was signed by Governor Rendell, so not implemented by Governor Corbett. And you have to remember there's a transition period there. There's two different administrations, so whether or not anything is binding, you know how that works when administrations change. I will tell you that I spent time with both the Park and Smarter Balance executive directors or their heads last year, and they were lobbying me to try and get Pennsylvania back on board. So they certainly don't think that they have Pennsylvania as a client. And what we liked about Keystones, going back to 2008, 2009, was that they're end-of-course exams. So I know we're not supposed to go into that today, but they really do make a lot better sense from the point of view of the business community of test right away, find out if there's a problem, remediate the problem. Don't let it wait. Don't let it go. And I think in that regard, we probably agree with others in the room that you might argue about which type of assessment you use, but this idea of assess your progress, assess your achievement, is something that is inherent in all kinds of businesses and certainly in government as well. Let me just come to one other thing on cost. Had an interesting, fascinating chat last week with a woman from McGraw-Hill. And she was showing me a document that they're providing to all school districts who have McGraw-Hill textbooks. It's a crosswalk that says, sure, we'd love you to buy our new Common Core books. However, here's the Common Core standards. And if you have our existing books, go over here, look up the book, here's the chapter, here's the page number. You can still use it because a lot of this material isn't new material. We're teaching at a different time period, we're teaching it differently, but then it also has what we really love in the business community, links to the real world. Here's how you can link that to what they will do in their career. Here's how you can bring in resource material from outside. That, coupled with, particularly in the language arts, the movement to understanding, comprehending, be able to use and write technical information was huge for us. The ability to do math at an Algebra 1 level, very, very important. And it's not all about, for us, college ready. A lot of it's the career ready, which means being ready for post-secondary education other than four-year schools. That's something that the military cares about. That's something I will tell you that the trade unions will tell you in Philadelphia and Pittsburgh, that they can't find people for their apprenticeship programs, who qualify for their apprenticeship programs, because they don't have the math skills or the language arts skills. And so that's why they're behind Common Core also. When the State Workforce Investment Board, which I have the good fortune to be on with Senator Smucker, took up the debate and the conversation about Common Core, it was a combination of business and labor that led the charge to say, that led to a unanimous adoption by the State Workforce Investment Board to endorse Pennsylvania's decision to do Common Core and Keystones. There's unanimity with everybody in dealing with the workforce that we've got to do better than we're doing. Is this flawless? No, nothing ever is. That's why we believe in continuous process improvement and want to keep looking at standards all the time. But it is a move forward. It's an improvement from where we are, and it's a decision that a good number of our 500 school districts are well on their way to achieving and I think being successful with. Again, will all 500 be there at the same time? Probably not. Just like the kids, you can't standardize them either. But that's what makes Pennsylvania great and makes our society rich. So with that, I'd be happy to take your questions.
Thank you very much for your testimony, and to both of you. But my first couple of questions are going to be for both of you, and I know you're not afraid of hard questions, so here we go. Dave and Joan, if I may be so informal.
Sure, please.
Your testimony, again, reminds me of the analogy I used earlier, that our Pennsylvania education system is like a road with nails, and rather than clearing the road of the nails, we keep changing the tires. Convince me Common Core is a real solution and not just a Band-Aid. And what makes Common Core different from any of the other initiatives that we have been developed over the years to improve Pennsylvania's education system?
So I'll use a different road analogy. I think Common Core is a map. And we could all decide today we all want to go to Boston, right? Consider a standard like Boston, right? So we want all our children to be able to go to Boston. And they're going to get there different ways. They're going to take different amounts of time to get there. But we all know we want them to get there, right? Because there's something important about Boston. For me, the Common Core, because of the partnership of governors and education chiefs and the experts that were consulted, we came to consensus in this nation and were validated by higher education and the business community and the military that this is the floor, right? That we've not done that before. We've not even done that in our own state. Not with that, that benchmarking to what's expected in those job training programs. And so for me, that's what makes this different. And there's going to be, people are going to get blowouts along that pathway, along that road to Boston, Senator. I'm not going to say it's not. But I think we have a common set of expectations now for our kids. And they're validated by what happens to our kids, the systems they will go to, job training programs, 2- and 4-year universities, and the military afterwards. Because ultimately, we all want our kids to be productive taxpayers, right? We want them to grow, be successful, be able to raise families, and contribute to our economy. That's what I think is different here.
And I understand that. And I think the reason I asked that, oh, Dave, did you want to make
Well, you have me at a disadvantage. You were the one who was in the tire business, so I have less expertise to work with your metaphor, but
My map didn't work on my road?
Where the rubber meets the road, dude.
Yeah.
Well, I gave you the road, Senator.
Well, I guess what I'm going to go for is that it's both. That we need to do both. That yes, and this is violating your rules, but things like the teacher evaluation program and everything helps to clear nails. And certainly teachers, poor performing teachers, which are a minority, but the poor performing teachers are not the only nails in the road. So we need to be taking all those other steps that your committee is looking at to help clear the road. But we also have to recognize that the road has changed in the 21st century. The 20th century road of the 1950s, 1960s was a straight interstate that I could barrel down at 90 miles an hour because it was perfectly straight and it didn't matter. Today's road in the global economy has a lot of curves, it has a lot of uphills, it has a lot of sudden downhills, and I need a stickier tire. I need a tire that can corner better. I need a tire that's more agile. I need a tire that's, yeah, I could make a tire harder so it doesn't blow out, but I'm going to lose all those other characteristics. And so today's tire has to be different than the old one. And the same with our education process. We're going to have to change, and this is the standards for how we're making those tires.
Well, and I understand that. I mean, I'm sorry, I didn't want to interrupt you. Are you through?
I'm hoping that was close to a good tire analogy.
That's pretty good. You're
Worked on that a lot
tire.
before we got here. We were sure you were going to ask about a tire.
But the reason I asked that and made that analogy is that, and I'm probably going to talk about the 800-pound gorilla in this room that nobody wants to talk about. And that is how we got to the position that we've gotten to, and why, after all the billions of dollars that we spent in education, we still are trying to find out what's going to be that perfect solution. Well, not perfect solution, or the next solution. Let me put it that way.
Right, and as you and I talked about, in June we'll celebrate the 30th anniversary of Ronald Reagan's landmark piece that was referenced earlier today.
Right.
A nation at risk, you could argue that we haven't moved. I think we have moved. And one of the things that I think we have to recognize is there is a perception among some in the public and among policymakers, oh, we're just not getting the job done. We're getting worse. And that's not fair to either the teachers, the school administrators, or the students. The fact of the matter is that globally everybody else is doing better too. So we're up against more competition, wider competition, more global competition. So we can't say that we've made no progress, because what we may want to say is, are we making progress as quickly as others are?
And again, the reason I ask that question is because unless we address the real nails, I think you can have the best high-performance tire you want, and I agree with you. We got to get out of this 19th century mode of education going into the 21st century. And I think we have the technology at our fingertips to be able to address individual scholastic ability per student because of that technological breakthrough and so forth. And that's why we had the hearing on hybrid learning and the different things that these other schools are doing. I don't think there's anybody in this room that will say that Algebra 1 should be Algebra 1 across the state, or English composition is English composition. I don't think there's anybody in this room that doesn't want their child to be competent in that field of study. But again, the reason I ask that question is that I'm cynical.
Well, Senator, I think that there's not one thing right? And I think you think the same in our conversations. We need to talk about how much money we spend. We need to talk about how we distribute it. We need to talk about what it buys. We need to talk about what are the results we expect from teachers. We need to talk about how they're trained in post-secondary education in our state, and what are the instructional strategies we use. We need to talk about how we make them accountable.
We need to talk about what the unions are going to allow us to do.
Reform, we need to talk about it all. But if we don't share a common set of expectations for what our children should know, it seems to me the rest of the conversation, it's building a house without a foundation. We don't have something to put our feet on the ground that firms us.
Next question.
Sure.
Convince me you two, and others aren't supporting Common Core simply to receive the federal monies that Pennsylvania might receive if adopting Common Core.
Well, this is where I'll defer to my colleague from the Cato Institute. There's not really any money there. So, that's not why. If $40 million is going to change our $26 billion state education funding system, the truth is what that money did and what that money is doing, and also what the Bill and Melinda Gates money did for the Commonwealth. The Gates money helped Pennsylvania build its first teacher evaluation pilot system. That then we modeled for state statute last year. The Race to the Top money is helping teachers, learn new instructional strategies and meet these standards. It's investments inside our schools. It's not bad stuff. But it's not enough money to change people's behaviors. I also would remind you that the...
Ditto to Cato.
Ditto. What she said. How do employers assess their employees' ability to perform their respective jobs? And part two of that question is, why don't we apply these same principles to education, students and teachers? For example, I believe Microsoft has an extensive certification program. Why not apply similar certifications to students and teachers?
I think we're trying to do some of that.
In part, it's obviously different, but some of the philosophical underpinnings to the way Keystone was designed are similar. And one of the biggest things there is to assess as you go, to not wait for junior year and try and do everything, and then they get the results back in the beginning of their senior year and we don't really have time to fix the issue or remediate. But what we do when we do certifications, since we were on tires before, one of the best job training programs I ever saw was created by Detroit back in the 90s, when they all recognized that they couldn't get auto mechanics anymore. And so they went together, the big three went together and formed a training academy in Detroit. And they addressed some other issues too. Like, for instance, people thought of auto mechanic as being a menial job, not worthy of their children to go into, the look and everything else. So we don't call them mechanics anymore, we call them technicians. We don't put them in overalls, we put them in lab coats. But remember too, what we did was we created those certifications. You walk into a dealership now, and you'll see hanging there, this person is certified in brakes and certified in exhaust systems and certified in turbochargers and whatever else, all those things hanging there. We created portable credentials, and that's what industry has really done that's good, where we certify each step of the way. Well, to some degree, and I don't want to stretch this too far, but to some degree that was the original idea of Keystones. And frankly, if you've read my previous testimony from other things I had given you, we didn't like moving from 10 to 5. We liked all 10. I want to see all those things hanging there that we know what the students are certified in, that they're certified in Algebra 1, Geometry, Algebra 2. I'd go through all of them. Certainly civics. Certainly we all know that our country needs more people to be literate in government and civics, the Constitution. I'll support your legislation. But I think the idea of making sure that Keystones and, for that matter, Common Core, because this is really what we're doing with Common Core, relates back to the real world and to real expectations. In math, the big difference, at least my understanding, from our old approach to what we saw in Common Core and the like, was the old standards in math and the old textbooks tended to be very, very broad, 100 and whatever different topics. And so not enough time was there to get deep in any of them and get proficient. What we've done is narrowed the number of topics that children are exposed to in the early parts of math. They can certainly take trigonometry and calculus in the later years. We're not saying they can't take algebra in 8th grade. We're only saying they have to take it by 9th grade. That's the floor versus ceiling kind of idea. So some like me will end up taking trigonometry in 11th grade and calculus in 12th, as I did back in the 70s. Others, might leave sooner than that from their math, but if it's career-based for what they're going to do and real-world expectations, and they're proficient in it before they move on, that's different than where we are today. So that's what our approach would be. So certify that they are proficient in those basic skills, and then add some more skills, and then certify that and move on again.
And, I think many of you know I had the pleasure to actually chair the Commission on College and Career Successes work group that made the first graduation competency assessment recommendation, which became Keystone Exam. So I've been in that part of the debate for over 7 years. And one of our big takeaways, in a very diverse way, was it made kids have skin in the game. And it's not fair to be punitive against children that haven't been given a fair opportunity to learn. Mm-hmm. But it's also not fair to let kids off the hook. And what we know about child development is that kids meet our expectations. They rise to them. They strive to them. And one of my problems, as a child advocate has been that I believe we expect different things for children in different communities in the state because of the conditions of that community. And that's not acceptable. So, part of what we are doing here is sort of you go talk to high school 11th graders around the state and ask them how seriously they take the SAT if they want to go to college. And I will tell you that my youngest, who is graduating from college next month, was actually a high school sophomore as we were beginning this conversation. And he was taking PSATs. And he and his friends didn't think the PSSA was a very big deal. Because, it really didn't have any consequence. But they thought the SAT was a huge deal. And so we can't penalize students who aren't giving ample opportunities, and that's why we support retaking, mandated remediation, and project-based assessment and resources. But at the same time, we have to have expectations for them. And on the teacher side, I think our new educator evaluation system is another way to talk about how well of our teachers are doing, how close are they coming to meeting those set of expectations, and then what are we doing for them, the teacher improvement plans, if they're not getting there. Our new school profiles are a way to look more comprehensively about what's happening in public schools in Pennsylvania than we have looked at in the past, which has simply been sort of the reporting of assessments. There's more we can do there, but I think we're getting there, and I think we have to demand that, and in our opinion, that has to happen in all public schools, charters, and district-operated public schools.
Like so many things, we have to enforce what we already have.
Absolutely.
We have a lot of school districts. Rampant is emergency certifications to get around hiring standards. So hiring teachers really aren't qualified under an emergency certification with no follow-up to find out if they ever went and got the certification.
And the flip side is considering alternative certification, right? So that's the challenging balance we're in public education. Senator.
My last question will be for you, Dave, Mr. Patty. You talked about who has been involved in the development of Common Core, business, and et cetera. However, I think Cheryl Boyce, who was on the last panel, made a very valid point about the need to involve parents. What role have parents had, should have, or will have in this process?
Well, I fully agree with her. Parents are a critical part of education. We've always known that. I don't know when the first study was because, there's so many things we don't think it's valid until somebody studied it. But I remember the Coleman report from 70, 72. Now, be careful what you wish for because that study was used then to justify forced busing. But we've always known that parents are important. Are we pretending that Joan and I and the governors and the chief state school officers aren't parents? It's not like they weren't also parents sitting in the room. So I think that's a little disingenuous. That somehow, what are we going to certify a separate parent kind of thing? Or you have to be part of the parents association to be, we're back to another association problem. So I think that's a little strange, frankly, as a topic. But everybody who was there, most of them were probably parents.
Yeah, well,
I
I mean,
think
we
we
could
need
go
to
around and
do-
around on this for forever, but, and I'm going to give up, I'm going to yield here to Senator Dimon, but just before I do, I just think with all the billions that we spent in education in the state of Pennsylvania, that wouldn't it just be simpler to come up with a price per student and then allow a parent to choose where they want to send their child? No, that's, please, we want to keep this going. That wasn't, I'm just, again, I go back to my, and I know I don't want to beat a dead horse, and I'm tired of the tire thing myself, but again, I just keep on looking at this as we're talking about, you know, all these nails are on the road and all these obstacles that we have to overcome, but yet we just keep on changing the tires, and maybe this will be the next best set that's going to get us to where we want to go. I certainly hope it does, and now I'm going to yield to Senator Dinniman.
Hello, everyone. It is a couple hours later, is it not? Dave, you represent a business, the business community. You guys are involved in purchases and acquisitions, and would you go out and advise your clients, or would members of the Business Roundtable purchase something without fully understanding the cost of what it is? I mean, the question here is this.
I suspect I shouldn't bring up Nancy Pelosi and the health care law, right?
Well, Nancy Pelosi might have done the wrong thing. That's all the more reason that Dave Patty, who says he's a conservative Republican, should not do the wrong thing. But the point is that there are two problems here. First of all, Joan makes a very good point. I don't know if the Pioneer study, which is the basis of that $645 million, has any factual basis. And I don't know, but I do know that the PSEA study that shows us $300 million has a more factual basis, because I saw what they did. And I do know that we are entering this with no clear understanding of what our school districts have to pay. Joan's right. If we're going to help these kids, then we have to give them 2 more tests. We can't label them as failures. We have to give them the opportunity to do project assessments. That costs money. The school districts don't have that money. So my concern is, how does a business organization advocate a program where we have no fiscal note? You wouldn't do that in your own business. And I think, and that's what the Democrats in part are saying. We're saying, it's strange that we're telling business to be more responsible, but we are, because you guys say to us all the time, run government like a business. And what we're saying back to you is you are supporting the establishment of a program where there's no fiscal note. The IRRC asked for that note. It was not prepared. We're only told that it's okay because, by the way, Joan, we have a moratorium for the last 2 years on professional development to save money.
We didn't cut the appropriation.
But the point is this, that concerns me. I don't understand, before we vote, any senator, any representative has to know its cost. And that's why we're asking for a pause. We just want to know what it is. And so so explain to me how the business community doesn't say we have to have that.
Well, I haven't said that we don't have to have that. I mean, I'd like to see it too. So I'm
But we
fine
only have
with you
20
asking that.
days if the governor
But-
said. So we're not going to, would you tell us to pause if that doesn't come to us? If we don't know the cost, and they haven't responded to the Interregulatory Commission's request for that cost, except in generalities, what it costs our local school districts. We do know the costs on the state, in fairness, but we don't know what the local school districts cost. And it's going to be a hell of a lot more money, by the way, in Harrisburg, where you have 50% not proficient, than it's going to be in Tredyffrin and Easttown, where I have 0.08 who are below proficiency and 3/4 who are becoming proficient in a PSEA, advanced
Because I know way too much about doing this, and I've done fiscal notes and everything else, and read lots of those sorts of studies. I mean, I don't look at the numbers. I look at the assumptions, because that's what really matters. What did they assume in generating Because I can create any bottom line number I want. It's the assumptions that if those are honest and transparent. So I want to know what the assumptions are that the agency would use, and what the assumptions are that the school districts and school superintendents and school administrators would use, because that's the discussion we need to know about. For instance, the study that we were just talking about, the assumption being, oh, you're using the computer-based testing, and we're not. So that's why I say, you need to know the assumptions before you can talk about what the numbers are.
Well,
If you, in a sense, I'll call it sensitivity analysis. I think that we felt like we had a pretty good range of what the possible numbers are from having been involved in discussions and following this for a number of years. If you're going to do testing this way, here's the range. If you're going to do pen and paper or pencil and paper still, then that goes down to this range. What are we going to put in? What do we currently put in for professional development? Does that have to go up or not?
That
Those
doesn't
sorts of
take care
things.
of our local school districts. The question is, and I happen to agree with Ms. Benson, that you cannot, in fairness to these young people, I know the cost for Harrisburg. I know the cost for Philadelphia and for Reading. They have no money, but yet they deserve the opportunity to take that test twice. They deserve the opportunity to have a project-based assessment. They deserve to be treated with dignity and respect, but yet, under this plan, all of that cost goes back to the local district. Oh, you have a fancy computer system that, that porthole that a teacher can get into, but come on. If you're in the classroom, it's you and the students. That it's very nice to have the resources that are provided by others. And I see nothing here in these schools in any of this that how we integrate the family into this as well, which is a key. So I'm just, you're answering me fairly, but I guess my answer back would be, if you're going to start up a company, don't ask me because I'm not invested. Right? Until I want to know the assumptions, but I also want to know what I'm getting and what the costs are for me when I do it. Let me ask a second question, if I may. The second question is you brought up Ronald Reagan. You brought up your good work as a conservative Republican, which I respect.
I think I'm losing those credentials.
Well, but the credentials.
I will say Dave and I are both comfortable with our personality profiles at the moment.
Well, that's fine, and that's good. But the question is, you were, if I'm not mistaken, communications director of the State Republican Committee when Earl Baker was chairman.
Right.
How do you respond then to the fact that the Republican National Committee 2 weeks ago issued a resolution against Common Core?
I think they're wrong.
All right, they're wrong. All right, then, and do you also say then that the 8 conservative Republican senators, led by Cochran in the Senate, which is a fifth of your delegation, fifth of the delegation of the 40-some Republican senators, were they also wrong when they asked for a pause and they asked to re-examine the money and the expenditures?
Senator, I think what we saw there is the same that we saw with your caucus yesterday, mostly political theater.
Oh, come off of it, David, Patty. If there's that's an attack on the Democrats, and we are more sincere. When you come to us as a businessman, and from the business and as a conservative Republican, and and say to us, hey man, invest in what we don't know how much money it's going to cost. And when the people you have supported year after year in election and are now saying we reject Common Core, don't talk about political theater to us. And in fact, a matter of fact, and I think Representative Teplitz will say the same. Peg has never even had the courtesy of ever inviting a Democrat to talk to you, except for that one time when I went with Senator Fulmer. We're never even considered when you're doing your endorsements. And how strange it is that the questions on Common Core, the questions are not wasting taxpayers' money. The questions, essentially, on unfunded mandates are not coming from you, the business community, but are coming from us, the Democratic Party. And all we have said is, we want every single child to be taught to the top of the curriculum. And it costs money. And we don't want a charade. If you're going to have standards, make it real. That's the position of our caucus. If don't have a game. If their standards are there, And Joan, I don't disagree with you one iota that we need standards. If the standards are there, don't pretend that you can make the cuts to education that we make. Don't pretend, if I can just read this for 1 second, that the Philadelphia Inquirer says the following, that the cuts in Philadelphia include a possible 3,000 layoffs, including teaching physicians, which would drastically impact classroom size and ultimately the amount of learning that occurs in the system that already suffers from high dropout and poor graduation rates. Gone would be the counselors and the librarians, sports and others extracurricular. There would be no dedicated funds for secretary, teacher's aides, or summer school. As school reform member Wendell Pritchett said, basic things that every child should have. Our caucus has stood up for this because we want to make sure every child has that. But what we're saying is that we're not going to adopt, we are holding on these standards. We are pausing until the finances are looked at and until we find a way that every child will be taught to the top of the curriculum. Now, Joan, in candor, both of us have the same aim. I have deep respect for you. You know, you can argue, and you can rightfully argue that unless we create the standards, we're not educating every child to the top because we don't have the expectations. On the other hand, I'm sure you can understand how we're arguing that it's false hope to have standards without the resources to meet those standards. And I know in my districts, it's far easier than Rob's district, Judy Schwank's district. So our legislators, we're trying to say to the business community, trying to say to everyone, listen, we don't oppose the standards. We do have the same questions about how we got there, but we don't oppose the standards. But what we want to make sure is that every child actually can make those standards. And Joan says we can do it. Even don't worry about the money. Let's at least get the standards. And I say the opposite. I say if you're going to have standards, have the money, or else it's false hope. And one more disappointment for the very people, Joan, and you're to be praised, who you've spent 20 years of your life trying to have us have a sense of dignity and respect for. And so we're really not apart. It's just a different way of doing it.
Well, Senator, I guess, and you and I have spoken not about Common Core,
but in general,
but on Keystones or GCAs probably 200 times over the last 7 years. And the exact same argument was used. The exact same argument. And, you know, my organization was a very big supporter of Governor Rendell's work to close the adequacy and equity gap. And the truth is, when you look at data about every district in this state, the adequacy and equity gap is quite different in some than others. So do we need more money for public schools? Absolutely. Do we need to spend it better in many, many places? Absolutely. And from our perspective, the standards are a framework of how we get that done. And they are the rationale for why we need to invest. So I don't believe that we can wait. And I will say that my organization figured out how to swallow hard and accept the Chapter 4 proposal when we didn't have a fully funded public education system. We had a $3+ billion adequacy gap, according to the Costing Out study. Did we make that worse in the last 3 years? Absolutely. But we weren't all the way there. And for us, we're willing to say, set the parameters, create reasonable outs for kids. The Chapter 4 regulatory body says if 10% of students can't meet them, the district needs to explain why.
No.
You know what? Oh, yeah, no, they need to be in a plan with the department. And we're not on that side today, but if we, and I'm more than happy to talk more about the Keystone proposal, but with the absence of standards, we have no common goals for the children in Pennsylvania.
Wow.
And as a mother and as a taxpayer and as someone who had the privilege of raising kids 7 miles from this city, that breaks my heart.
I understand where you are. What breaks the heart of the Democratic caucus is we don't oppose standards, but we want to know, are these standards, we want to look at them, we want to understand them, we want this paused, and we want to put up the resources so that every child can make it. Because I don't see, David, how the students in Rob's district, the 45% who aren't making it now, when we raise the standards without specific programs and without the ability, how they're going to make it later. So
But
we
Senator,
don't disagree,
I would urge
Joe.
you to
We
go
just-
back. I would urge you to go back to the costing out study that you and I both.
That has been
Let me-
rejected
well,
already by
okay,
the
but
Senate.
you and I didn't disagree with that, and so I'm talking
Yes.
you to me, that found it to be a valid base. And you will see in reviewing the costing out study that there are districts that have much lower adequacy gaps
Oh, there's no question.
let me finish my point, please, than others that are performing much worse. And that point was actually made by the Harrisburg Patriot in an editorial at that point in time, that we have districts with larger adequacy gaps in the Harrisburg area doing better than districts with smaller adequacy gaps. And that speaks to how we use the money,
Well,
not
then
just how much
we don't
money.
question how we use the money, but we all know as we sit here that there are over 10,000 less teachers now in Pennsylvania.
I don't disagree with that.
13,000 very soon with Philadelphia if the Corbin administration doesn't step up to the plate. We all know that that all those tutoring programs that you urged the state to have under Governor Rendell when we had separate funding for tutoring.
Well,
when had
actually,
the
we never
separate
supported the tutoring program.
Accountability grant.
The accountability
Let me just
block
finish
grant
this one last
program we
thing.
supported.
We all know.
No, you
that-
can continue. I just wanted to ask her this question on the same line.
Go ahead.
Yeah, right.
That they're gone.
I think one of the greatest problems that I had as a state senator with the costing out study is that, number one, it threw out the lowest cost, high-performance schools and then relied heavily on hypothetical school districts and hypothetical monies. And so the problem, that's the problem I had. So, Andy, you can...
Let me ask this. Joan, your group has done tremendous work. I remember the issue of your newsletter. It's not a newsletter. It's really a report you had on dropouts. And you suggested to us what we could spend it on and how we can solve the problem and the partnerships we use. So I wanted to see your reaction. You know, Diane Rafovich is one of the great education scholars, whether you're on the left or the right. She's a tremendous.
Highly
She wrote The
respected.
Life and Death of the American School. And she wrote an interesting column. It said, why I cannot support the Common Core standards. This would be someone who we would expect would support it, really, in terms of where her politics are, where she's coming from.
Very
And this-
opposed to assessments.
well, but let me read
That
you.
doesn't surprise me she's opposed to the
Well, let
Common
me
Core.
read you what she says here from this essay, and just get your intake on it. Another reason I cannot support the Common Core standards is I am worried that they will cause a precipitated decline in test scores based on arbitrary cut scores. And this will have a disparate impact on students who are English learners, students with disability, and students who are poor and low performers. When Kentucky piloted the Common Core proficiency rate, the Common Core standards, the proficiency rates of these students dropped by 30%. Do you have a concern? I understand putting standards up, the importance of standards, but how do we help the student today if we don't have the funding and the proper means for the student when we put another stamp of failure on that student, and we put another stamp of failure, as Senator Brewster would say, not only on that student, but on that community, which will hinder that community from having any form of meaningful economic development, because no business is going to a community that the state confirms again and again as a failure.
Well,
But-
let me just reply by saying two things.
Yeah.
If you look at what's happened in the state of Kentucky, and Dr. Dumarisk said earlier, we should expect when our assessments are fully aligned with Common Core, 2 academic years from now, that assessment scores will go down. More kids will not perform at proficient levels, and that's because the expectations are higher, right? We should expect that to happen, and that happened in Tennessee, and now it's changing. It's going back up, right? And it's going where
Kentucky
it...
we're talking about.
Well, no, I was
Tennessee.
referencing Tennessee. I'm familiar with Tennessee. I'm not familiar with the data in Kentucky. The other thing I would say, Senator, is that we fail children when we let them graduate from a Pennsylvania high school, in some cases with honors. and they go to Hack or Millersville, and they can't take a college course for credit.
Joan, you're basing that...
We want to restore the integrity of the Pennsylvania high school diploma because we think we are failing kids in our schools, and by letting them graduate and having them be unable to go take post-secondary education courses, go to job training, or join the military, and not be able to take those core assessments to get in.
You would have to
It's a
convince...
tragedy.
What you are telling us is that your program of Common Core standards, your program of required graduation tests is going to somehow change all this.
I'm telling you, I
only
think
wish that it does, and I hope it does. But I, unfortunately, agree with a lot of what Senator Fulmer is saying, that this is simply another tire in the road. And what I want to pause long enough is to understand the nature of that tire. And I want to pause long enough to understand its impact on students, its impact on communities, and ultimately its impact on our responsibility to be fiscally responsible, to spend that money well. And that's the reason our caucus is not because we don't think standards are a good idea, not because we oppose accountability. We think that, and in fact, the majority of us would probably say Common Core standards are fine. I don't have trouble with the standards you want to do. I might have some trouble how you got there, but I don't have trouble on the standards you want to do. But we, again, say stop long enough to look around, and so that when we make this investment, it's the correct investment to make. And we could go on, and in interest of time, I'll stop. But it's that's where we have the fundamental difference. I hope that my Republican caucus colleagues, enough Republicans, will join with the Democrats in simply asking for a pause. We're not asking this to be 2 years or 3 years, 4 years. Hopefully the governor won't submit it. If he does, we're prepared to put the legislation in, and then each senator will vote his district and the interest of his district and the interest of how he perceives its citizens to be. This doesn't kill Common Core. This doesn't stop Common Core. But this does allow the people who are here today and the people in our poorer communities to have a discussion. You will see next week people in the poorest communities who 2 weeks when we're back, Joan, the very people you care deeply about, people of Senator Kitchen and Senator Washington and others who rep Senator Teplitz, Senator Schwenk, the people who represent these poor people in remonstrances, simply raising these questions, not attacking the notion of standards, not attacking the notion of accountability, but questioning whether these tests are the proper way to accountability, but simply asking us, let's make the standards real. Let's make it possible for every child to achieve those standards. And I stop on that because that's something you and I could agree on, to make it real for every single child.
Senator, how we get there and when we get there, I guess you and I are going to have to disagree on.
Absolutely. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Senator Smucker.
Well,
Wow.
I'm not even sure what to say, but I do have some comments. I think I'll go back to something that I mentioned in the beginning, and that is when you talk about Common Core, you end up talking about a whole bunch of things that have nothing to do with Common Core, and that clearly is the case today. Only once in this entire hearing did I hear anyone mention anything about specific standards compared to previous standards. And that was when one of the testifiers said that Common Core may be taking us to algebra in 9th grade rather than 8th grade. That was the only time, unless I missed it. And I say that again to say, and I'll make a few comments as well on some of the things that were mentioned. Funding for education. I think Senator Fulmer has a great idea, and I would support that. We've had much debate around the level of funding for education. We'll continue to do that. The school choice, again, I'll mention it again. I think that would be the one thing that could have the most impact on the quality of education in Pennsylvania if we implemented a good school choice system. And many other topics that we've talked about today. But then you get back to Common Core. And, you know, to me, as a legislator who ultimately has to decide what makes sense in any given situation, we've got to try to figure out what the facts are. And then ultimately we're faced with maybe not necessarily making a decision in this case. We could stop Common Core if there were enough legislators that agreed to it. But so in any case, we are forced to sort of slice and dice the information and make decisions based on what we think is correct. One of the mistakes that many of us make all the time, myself included, is that when we subscribe to the views of an individual, we believe everything that individual says. And in fact, we rely on labels a lot to shape our viewpoints. Are you conservative? Are you liberal? If you're liberal, I don't agree with anything you say. If you're conservative, I don't agree with anything you say. And the trick is trying to find what works and where we can find common ground on any topic. So despite the fact that Senator Dinniman and I may not agree on every topic, we have worked together on many and agreed on many and have achieved some things. So back to Common Core. To me, it comes down to just that. How are these standards compared to our previous standards? That's what Common Core is to me. And you can get into the argument about how they were put into place, whether it was federal, and I know that's a huge concern to a lot of folks. I'm concerned about the federal overreach. But, you know, you get into the argument of, was this state-driven? I sort of think it was. But you could make the argument that, yes, there was some federal involvement. There clearly is some federal involvement. But to me, none of that matters. What matters is whether the standards are good. All right? It doesn't matter where they came from, to me, ultimately. I care about federal overreach. But are the standards good or aren't they? And so, again, I've had a lot of discussion with superintendents. I've had discussion with parents. I've had discussion with the IU director, IU folks. I've had discussions with textbook I don't know if manufacturers is the right, publishers, there we go. And you know, I just don't see it, that these standards are a dumbing down of the standards we have in place. And again, I asked in the beginning of this hearing if there are specific examples of that. I'm all ears, and I will continue to be all ears after this hearing because I don't think this is the end of the discussion. But I'd encourage everyone to focus on that. I don't care if it came from the federal administration. I don't care if it came from the state association of governors. What I care about is whether the standards will help ensure that we have a quality education for our kids in Pennsylvania. Neither do I care necessarily what other states are doing or what's happening at the federal level. I care about the decisions that are made here in Pennsylvania by our Board of Education, by our school boards across the state, and whether they will impact the quality of the education. So that's what I get back to. And to me, you can put aside 90% of what we discussed today and get down to the heart of this discussion here. There are just a few other things. You know, one of the most disheartening things I heard today was that we don't want to commingle private dollars with public dollars. Come on. We have in Pennsylvania a wonderful program called the EITC program. I bet everybody in this room, no, it may not be true, not everybody supports this program, but it's one of the most successful programs across Pennsylvania to help education. What does it do? It encourages businesses to give to our schools, whether they be private or public. So there's commingling of private and foundation dollars all the time, and we're really grateful for it. So it was disheartening to me to question, unless there's basis for it, I didn't hear any, to question the motives of organizations that are giving who I believe really care about the quality of education for our kids. I just wanted to mention that the EITC program every day is commingling foundation or business dollars, to be more precise. And we certainly welcome in Pennsylvania the dollars that are given by many businesses, many individuals, and many foundations to help in our educational system. I do have maybe one question, and I don't know whether either of you would be able to answer this, but the issue of parental involvement. I know in my district, the Common Core is a concern for many parents, and there have been a number of school board meetings that I'm aware of where Common Core was a topic of discussion and where parents were involved. And in fact, I would suggest I still very much support decisions being made as much as possible at the local level, and parents should be involved, and that's a great place for parents to get involved in their kids' education. What I don't know, and I was asked the question, how much with Common Core, with the adoption of our standards that we've had in place, are school districts required in Pennsylvania to adopt the standards in return for the state dollars? Is there a link, or do ultimately the elected school boards, elected by the parents and the taxpayers, do they have the ability to set the curriculum? It might be based on a set of standards, but can they choose the curriculum for their district?
So I would argue that parent engagement and meaningful involvement in public schools in Pennsylvania and around the country is inadequate. And as far as I know, there are no formal requirements for a school district to have engaged parents in the determination of curriculum. The school district strategic plans used to have a requirement for involvement of parents in district planning. That is going away. So the answer is no. There is no. And that's unfortunate. And I think people would argue that, I think many of us in this room have been parents, and we've probably been at times proud of our engagement in our children's public education and less proud. And what we know about it is parents tend to be more engaged when their children are younger and less engaged as their kids get older. Just because we are less engaged in caring for a teenager, right, and worrying about how they're getting back and forth to here and there. We spend less time at schools. But there needs to be more. But the argument, I guess, on the other side is that we're voters. We elect school boards. School boards are empowered by statute to have those responsibilities.
I mean, I guess one of the questions that I'd like to have a better answer to, in which I'll tend to look at.
Senator, if I can have one, if you'll indulge me for a second, as we're walking out, actually, I want to thank you guys for coming. And it's kind of fun because a couple of weeks ago I was doing a different kind of event up in the Rotunda with a bunch of people with yellow shirts yelling at me, and that was liquor. So, I mean, at least I'm consistent with the yellow shirts, I guess. But the great thing is democracy only works when people show up, so it's a real testament that you're here. I hope more parents do go to their school meetings, go to meet the teacher night and all that kind of stuff, because it only works when that happens.
But I think it's very important. One of the things that worries...
Thank you all.
Yes. One of the things that worries our organization is... And maybe it's a solution we need to think about what the School Boards Association and the Administrators Associations and the teachers unions about, and the department, about how we better communicate factual information with parents about not only the state's goals and the district's goals for public education, but, opportunities for them to be engaged. We've not done a good job here, Senator. You're hitting the nail on the head.
One of the areas I want to learn a little more about is specifically how local school boards implement standards and curriculum. It's a little area.
Standards are state, curricula is the school district. So it's, as Joan, to go back to her map.
That's my understanding.
Right.
So I think there is a lot of opportunity for parents to be involved at the school district level. But I want to just clarify that later. So
let me make a huge mistake and confuse the matter. But to Senator Dinniman's concern about cost, what the state has done is to say, here's a model curriculum, here's some model things available to any school district who wants to take it, so you do not have to take on that cost yourself as a school district. So there was an attempt to mitigate the cost. But it's not imposed. It's not required.
And if anything was made clear today by every testifier, there's agreement that we need a standard in place. Right. And I think many folks believe that there should be a standard in place across the state. not across the federal. That's clear with a lot of individuals, but many have said, yes, we should. We need a standard. You need a way, and I'll go back to the point as well, $5 billion being spent every year. I could not, as a lawmaker, agree to that without knowing what kind of results we're getting for those dollars. So I think you have to have some sort of testing as well. So I'll leave it at that. We could talk.
I just want to respond to one of your points, because I think you were stepped out of the room for a moment. Your question about how do these standards align to our prior standards. And the standards that, in July 10, we all know, we adopted the Common Core. And what the Chapter 4 revision is being contemplated now is to indeed add to that national change a little bit in the parameter that we're allowed to for 15%. One of the big pieces is early learning. But when those standards were crosswalked, there's a study by the University of Pittsburgh to what were our prior academic standards. It was demonstrated that particularly as we got to middle school and above, these standards were more rigorous. So if that is, I just want to be sure you're feeling comfortable that you've gotten that information.
Thank you.
And if I can elaborate on one of your points there, in terms of across the state, let me use as an example ArcelorMittal, largest steel manufacturer in the world, has 4 facilities in Pennsylvania. I'm not up to speed on the new map. I think one in Senator Teflitz's district, one in Senator Dinniman's district, one in Senator Leach's district, and the other one may be Senator Brewster. All right? So they need to be able to take people who are going to come to them for employment and have a training program and safety programs and safety manuals and everything that they can all, and frankly, they're going to be standardized manuals. They're going to have certain standards. They need to know that the workforce coming in is ready to read that. It's not fair to the worker in Steelton if they can't read the manual and can't qualify for the job while the one in Montgomery County or the one in Chester County can, kind of thing. So there is a reason, an economic reason, but also an equity reason in terms of access to those good jobs that we always talk about. In the same company across the state that has multiple facilities with multiple districts. So thank you.
Thank you. Senator Templis, thank you so much for your patience.
That's okay. No problem. No, quite honestly, I was thinking this is why I ran for office. I mean, we've had a full day of substantive policy discussions this morning on paying for higher education, this afternoon on standards and testing, and worked almost a full day, and that's rare. In both senses, and so I'm very glad to do this, and I really commend both chairmen and my other colleagues who were here, because this has been a good discussion. I came in this with a very open mind, not knowing much about Common Core, other than I was starting to get mail over the last few weeks from both sides of the issue, but my basic concerns, for the most part, I still have from this morning, and I'm somewhat surprised by that, because I'm certainly familiar with both of your organizations. They're both reputable organizations that do great work in providing public policy research for us. But I think you both undermine your own arguments in very significant ways. And quite honestly, after listening to both of you, I'm less inclined to adopt your position than I might have been this morning. Ms. Benso, I don't think that you have a realistic grasp on the relationship between resources and the ability to succeed. I was fortunate 25 years ago to go to a high school that had adequate resources. Not every high school, not every school district has that. And so it's easy to say, well, Harrisburg School District should have the same expectations as a school district 7 miles away. And in the abstract, that sounds great. But the reality is they don't have the same resources. And it's tremendously unfair to label those students as failures and then have whatever consequences are drawn out from that, not just for those students, but for the school district, for attempts to privatize public education, et cetera, because of a contrivance, perhaps, of labeling these students as failures. I mean, there's a reality here, and I don't think it's sufficient to say, well, we have to ignore that and take a deep breath or swallow hard, or however you put it, and just move forward. I don't think that's realistic. And Mr. Patty, I don't think it's fair to say, and again, this gets at another one of my main points this morning, to say, well, we're all parents who were in the room developing this and promoting it. I mean, that may be true, but there's a big difference between, white upper middle class public policy experts being in the room developing, these standards and the approach to selling these standards in an ivory tower, and families who, are dealing with this in a very practical way day to day on the ground. I don't think it's fair to say that it was, okay for a lack of outreach to the real families who are going to be dealing with this because you guys happen to be parents. No one's disputing the fact you guys happen to be parents, but that's not getting the real people involved. That was my concern this morning with the Department of Education, and it remains it. I think it's a very, quite honestly, a very elitist view from both of you that I heard that doesn't serve your own arguments. I mean, I agree with Senator Dinniman. I think we should have standards. We should make sure that all students can achieve. But the issue here may be more how you've gone, how the Department of Education has gone about it, and how you are trying to sell it. And I don't particularly appreciate the way that this was presented by the two of you, because it makes our job harder. And I just think that if we're going to move forward with this, and if you're going to be advocating for it, and again, it may be a perfectly appropriate public policy, you need to inject the realities that I talked about. And I don't expect a comment. I don't want to get into a debate, but I think it is tremendously unfair to not take into account the situation on the ground that real families are dealing with, and instead look at this in sort of an ivy tower sort of way. So that's my comment.
Again, Senator Smucker, I think you had it.
If you may, Chairman, I would just like to respond to the comments by Senator Teplitz, the first part of your comments. I serve a district that is fortunate to have some really good school districts, Lancaster, York County. But there are wide differences in the achievement levels of students within the counties. I have urban districts, an urban district in Lancaster, and border the York City School District, which is in the financial hardship. And in fact, I have worked within our caucus to, in each of the last 2 years, add additional funding over what had been proposed that would support the urban districts. Because I truly believe that the quality of the education in Pennsylvania should not depend on your zip code. However, and this is what I'd like to address, the only way you will know and be able to compare the quality of education from one district to another is to have a set of standards in place and a set of assessments so that you know how students are performing. And the mistake that's being made is that you're going to the second part of the equation. We first got to know where we are. The facts are what they are. And you can't argue with facts. So we've got to have standards. We've got to have assessments. Then we can identify there's a problem, and we've got to figure out how to solve it. But if you don't do the first part, you can never get to the second.
No, real quick, I don't disagree with that, but the point is the Department of Education has linked the standards with the test. Absolutely. Without providing the adequate resources to make sure that that test does not have consequences, negative consequences, unfair consequences on the students in the school district. And so I think that's our caucus's point, that we would be supportive, we all should be supportive of measuring what's out there. Does the state get its money's worth? Are kids being educated? Does the business community get trained workers? We should all be supportive of that. But the question is it fair to impose consequences for the outcomes of those tests based on those standards when some districts are going to be starting further behind than others due to a lack of resources? And maybe the resource issue is a conversation for another day, but it is inherent in this discussion, and that's where I was particularly aggravated by Ms. Benso's comments that didn't seem to take into account that reality.
Senator Schmucker, if I may, Mr. Chairman, you know, I love talking with Senator Schmucker. We've been through so many arguments and things together. But listen, here's what happened. The Department of Education, when it applied to get exemption from No Child Left Behind, put the standards with the graduation test, separate tests for graduation requirements. So it's impossible for us in the legislature now, if we have to review and look at this, to do one without the other. So that's why I can agree with you entirely about the standards. And I think you and I probably come up with the same standards. But what's happening now, well, I think so, I really do. I don't know. But
I'm not qualified to make the standards, just to be clear.
No. But what I'm trying to say, Lloyd, is here's the problem. That if we approve Common Core, we then, and don't object to if the governor sends it in and don't object to the regulations, then what happens is every student will be required to have a graduation test. And for that student in Lancaster, saying, by the way, your attempt to try to make things better is exactly what you did with your DREAM Act, and I thank you for that. But what happens is, so everyone has a chance, an opportunity. But what happens then is, if the resources were there, then that student could get to supplemental remediation and get someone to work with them one-on-one on the project assessment and have an opportunity. Our concern as a caucus is the resources aren't there, and we don't even know how much it's going to cost the local school districts to achieve that. So I do agree with you. We're together on the standards, and the only reason we're asking for a pause is so we can ultimately, you, I, all four of us, all end up at the same place. Because I think that we have a path to do so, but I don't. But the department, the way they ask for No Child Left Behind exemptions, has prevented us from getting there. That's the only point I would make.
Senator Temples?
Senator, if I could just make one quick point, just to be aware that the emphasis has been on the improvement within the testing, not the raw score on year one, because I fully agree with you. If you start with lots of disadvantages, you're going to score low. Now, arguably, it's possible that those who start lowest have the easiest ability to show some improvement first. Given the challenges and everything else. But at the very least, it's really about the improvement. It's about getting to the improvement. And I think you're right. If you demonstrate, to Senator Smucker's point of view, that those challenges are insurmountable, that's a discussion to bring back into the loop on the funding discussion. To say, look, they're doing all the things that you said. They've been implementing your standards. They've done the test that you've said, and this is the challenge. And it gives you a feedback loop.
I'll just make one additional comment as well, and I really appreciate the chair allowing this kind of discussion to take place.
Good
discussion. I don't think that we are far apart.
No, we're not.
In terms of the need for standards and assessments. Mm-hmm. I think the real question is what happens after that. Mm-hmm. And to me, it makes a stronger argument for implementing consistent, strong standards, because then the problem will become more glaring, and then policymakers will be forced to look for solutions.
But if we-
That's the only area I think that we disagree.
No, I don't
in
even
this.
disagree with you on that. The only difficulty I'm having, or I think the members of our caucus are having, is that there are consequences in terms of graduation. You know, the kid who stays there for 4 years, all the temptations in the community to leave, and then we don't graduate them. And we don't help, unless our local school boards can come up with the funds, they don't have the funds to provide the additional resources. And I don't know how to solve that, because we don't have the money statewide. And the other part of it is Lloyd, Senator Schmucker, is, you know, where we're similar to is in our districts. You have Lancaster, I now will have Coatesville. But the greatest number of complaints to come into the IRRC were actually from the best districts. The greatest number came in from Tredyffrin School District, TE, which has a 3/4 proficiency, advanced proficiency rate and only a .089. And why did they complain? Because what our good districts are saying is, leave us alone. We work. You know, Tredyffrin and TE, 35 National Merit Scholars. We have 97% post-graduation rate. You know, our total dropout last year was 1 student. And we worked like heck to try to get that student to stay in. Now, when you have a record like that, and you have a local community that's willing to put up the money and willing to do that, what they are simply asking the state and federal government to do is mind their own business, because we work. Now, what we have to figure out is how to take your great districts, you know, that you put the 3 of them together. They don't really need us very much. They know how to solve the problem. How can we do that and yet help the Coatesville and Lancasters? And that's another question we have to figure out.
Mr. Chairman, could I respond to Senator Teplitz's comment towards me? I know
You
you want to
certainly
close.
may. We
So
heard this
I just
long
want to
and-
say, Senator Teplitz, I'd love to talk to you more about this. I think we begin in a different place. Is that simple? We have fought long and hard and will continue to fight for adequate resources for children in public education. But if I happen to agree with Senator Schmucker, I think that our effort collectively, well-intended public officials, tireless advocates are losing the fight obscenely to adequately fund Pennsylvania's public schools. And I don't worry a lot about the kids in TE, and I have a niece and nephew that go to school there, and I don't worry a lot about the kids in Cumberland Valley. And I do worry about the kids in our lowest income school districts, and our kids that have disabilities, and our kids that are English language learners. And I think until we can say, by standards, every one of those children deserves the same thing, we won't win the funding battle. And that's why we support this regulatory body, because it does not go into effect next year. There are no graduation consequences till 2017, and we've already pushed that out once. And I fundamentally believe we will have I probably shouldn't say it, but I think we will have a very strong argument to increase public education funding in an equitable and adequate way when we have better demonstrated the differences between what kids can and cannot do and have and don't have. You know, again, I don't want to take more time up this evening.
Well,
I'm happy to talk to you more.
Just to be clear, I've been doing education policy work myself for
I
the
know you
last
have.
15 years.
I know you have.
Okay? So that's number one. And number two is, I think it is a leap of faith that I'm not prepared to make,
Appreciate that.
that the consequences may be out into the future, but we're going to start labeling our kids as failures now, because there are many of us who believe that there are forces that want to privatize public education, and this may be one more argument in order to do that. And so I'm not willing to go down that road without assurance that we're not going to get there.
Mm-hmm. I appreciate that.
I think we've reached a conclusion.
Well,
Mr. Chairman.
on that note, though, I will be amiss if I do not bring out the fact that a lot of talk has been about the underfunding of education today. I just want to point something out that I think is very sobering. Just out of our general budget, folks, we're spending presently in the state of Pennsylvania $344 each second. So every time you clip your finger, it's $344. And if you look at our total spend, That combining our local real estate property taxes along with the contributions from our general fund, also the tax dollars coming down from the federal government, and about $500 million from gaming, you're going to be looking at about over $850 each and every second. So as we going forward, and we talk about funding or underfunding of education, the question should really be, how much will it take to finally get it done? Now, the idea of this hearing, and I want to thank the audience for being very patient. You guys were great. Thank you so much for being here. You showed a great lot of a couple applauses here and there, but we got through that. And I want to thank you. I also want to thank all the testifiers who came and to testify. I want to thank my fellow members here for being patient and staying here. I think we've had a good hearing. I think a hearing where we got some information out, and I think it'll be good, and we'll get it on record. And on that note, I'm going to say that the Senate Education Committee hearing on Common Core is closed.